The bystander effect. The bystander effect is one of the most chilling phenomena in social psychology, not because it's rare, but because it's disturbingly common. At its core, it is the observation that the more people who are present during an emergency, the less likely any one individual is to offer help. Responsibility becomes diluted, empathy suppressed, and action paralyzed. The term gained notoriety following the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York City. She was attacked outside her apartment building, stabbed multiple times over a prolonged period. According to early reports, 38 people witnessed the assault, and yet no one intervened. No one called the police. No one came to her aid. Although some details of the event have since been contested or clarified, the psychological horror it revealed remains. In a crowd, morality can vanish, compassion can go silent, responsibility can die. This is the bystander effect. The phenomenon was formally studied by psychologists John Darley and Bib Latané in the aftermath of the Genovese case. Their landmark experiments in the late 1960s exposed the terrifying truth. People are far less likely to help when they believe others are watching, or more precisely, when they believe others could help instead. They called this psychological paralysis diffusion of responsibility. In one of their most famous studies, participants were led to believe they were having a private conversation via intercom with another person. But in some versions of the experiment, they were told there were multiple people on the line. When the other person appeared to have a seizure and called out for help, only 31% of participants in the group setting responded, compared to 85% when they believed they were the only witness. The conclusion was grim. The presence of others makes it easier to do nothing. And in the real world, doing nothing often means watching tragedy unfold without lifting a finger. The psychology behind this is as disturbing as the behavior itself. When in a group, people engage in social referencing, looking to others for cues on how to act. If no one else seems alarmed, the individual suppresses their own alarm. Everyone is silently checking with each other, and everyone is silently deciding to stay still. This creates a feedback loop of inaction, a crowd full of people who are individually uncomfortable but collectively passive. Fear of embarrassment, fear of overreacting, fear of standing out, all conspire to paralyze. There's also pluralistic ignorance, a cognitive error where each person assumes they're the only one who feels unsure or distressed. Everyone believes the silence of others means there's no emergency. So they mirror that silence. The result? A room full of people who all privately feel wrong but do nothing. The bystander effect doesn't require violence to manifest. It happens in schools, workplaces, families. A colleague is bullied, a student breaks down in tears, a friend hints at suicidal thoughts, and the group hesitates, rationalizes, leaves it to someone else. The darker truth? Sometimes the silence is not ignorance, it's convenience. Because helping takes effort, it takes risk, it requires making someone else's pain your problem. And so people look away. In extreme cases, this indifference becomes inhumane. Victims have died in public spaces, recorded by phones, watched by dozens, while no one called for help. Not because the bystanders were evil, but because they were ordinary. That's the horror. The bystander effect is not about monsters. It's about normal people doing nothing. It's not just a flaw in character, it's hardwired into group psychology. Neuroscience research shows that when people witness distressing events in crowds, the amygdala, the brain's emotional alarm, activates. But so does the medial prefrontal cortex, involved in social reasoning and conformity. The brain fights itself. One part screams help, the other whispers, wait, is anyone else helping? And in that split second of hesitation, harm is done. In modern culture, the bystander effect has metastasized through technology. Now, in moments of crisis, people reach for their phones, not to call for help, but to record. Tragedy becomes content. Empathy becomes likes. Suffering becomes something we observe, analyze, debate, but not necessarily stop. There is something deeply disturbing about a world where a cry for help is met with a camera. It's easy to believe you'd act differently, that in a true emergency you'd rise above. But the data says otherwise. Most people freeze. Most people defer. Most people hope someone else will step in. The bystander effect is not a lack of caring. It's a system failure in human response. a flaw in collective behavior that turns good people into silent witnesses. There are ways to fight it, but they require deliberate training. Emergency responders, military units, and ethical bystander programs use specific techniques to overcome diffusion of responsibility. Chief among them, assigning accountability, pointing to someone and saying, "You, call 911. It cuts through ambiguity, it forces action, it breaks the loop. In therapy and trauma-informed care, understanding the bystander effect is crucial. Victims often internalize the inaction of others, believing that if no one helped, their suffering must not be real. The silence becomes its own form of violence, a second wound, and for those who did nothing, the guilt lingers. Many who have witnessed violence without intervening report symptoms of PTSD, shame, and long-term emotional distress. The silence haunts. To resist the bystander effect is to choose discomfort, to act when others stand still, to step forward when everything in your body tells you to disappear. It is not easy, but if no one breaks the silence becomes complicity. Because in the end, evil doesn't always announce itself with a scream. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a room full of people, standing still, eyes averted, hearts racing, doing nothing. Triangulation. Divide, manipulate, conquer. Triangulation is a psychological manipulation tactic in which one person controls a relationship or group dynamic by introducing a third party into the conflict, intentionally or otherwise. It's not always overt. Sometimes it masquerades as concern. Other times it wears the mask of connection. But its core purpose is always the same: to destabilize trust, enforce control, and maintain power through division. In simple terms, triangulation creates alliances to isolate a target. One person, the manipulator, speaks negatively about someone behind their back, seeks validation from another, or turns individuals against each other to serve their agenda. The relationships are no longer linear or honest. They are triangular and toxic. In psychological theory, triangulation was first formally described by Murray Bowen, a pioneer in family systems therapy. He observed that in high-conflict families, members often bring a third person into their emotional disputes to ease anxiety, turning a dyad, two-person system, into a triad. In children, this often looks like being pulled between fighting parents. In adults, it can look like gossip, back-channeling, or emotional splitting. But when triangulation is done with intent to control, it takes on a darker, more sinister role. It becomes a tool of psychological warfare. In narcissistic abuse, triangulation is one of the most common and devastating tactics. The narcissist may idealize one person while devaluing another, then swap roles without warning, keeping both parties uncertain, insecure, and desperate for approval. They might say things like, "You're so much more understanding than my partner ever was. Everyone thinks you're overreacting. I'm just the only one honest enough to tell you." Or worse, "Don't tell them I said this, but they're not really on your side." The goal is control. The narcissist uses others as emotional weapons, creating a dynamic where the target feels alone, paranoid, and constantly on edge. Instead of confronting issues directly, they sow discord, turning people into pawns, conversations into traps, and relationships into battlegrounds. In romantic relationships, triangulation often appears through jealousy games. A partner may flirt with someone else, mention an ex repeatedly, or compare their current partner to others, all to keep them off balance and seeking validation. The unspoken message is, "You are replaceable." That fear makes the partner easier to manipulate. In families, triangulation can play out across generations. A parent may confide in one child about another, creating alliances and rivalries. The golden child and the scapegoat are not roles that form naturally. They are often engineered through emotional manipulation, and once the roles are set, they're hard to break. In workplaces, triangulation emerges as office politics, whisper campaigns, or managers pitting employees against each other to maintain authority. It creates an environment of mistrust, where no one feels safe and no one speaks freely. Productivity suffers, morale collapses, but the manipulator remains in control, untouchable, because they've turned everyone else into enemies. Triangulation is not always about aggression. Sometimes it's cloaked in victimhood. A manipulator may seek sympathy from a third party to paint themselves as the injured one, weaponizing empathy to turn others against someone they claim is abusive or unfair. They don't need proof. just suggestion. And they often succeed, because humans are wired to believe stories, especially when they come from someone who appears vulnerable. The psychological foundation of triangulation rests on projective identification and splitting. The manipulator splits others into good and bad, then projects internal conflicts outward. Instead of dealing with their own insecurities, they infect others with them, subtly assigning roles in their own personal drama. The triangulated parties often don't realize they're being used until it's too late. Studies in clinical psychology show that triangulation is prevalent in high-conflict relationships, particularly where personality disorders such as narcissistic, borderline, or histrionic personality disorder are present. It's also common in unresolved trauma survivors, where emotional regulation is low and external control becomes a coping mechanism. Triangulation creates an illusion of intimacy. The manipulator often feigns closeness with the third party by confiding in them, but it's not real connection. It's manipulation disguised as vulnerability. Meanwhile, the person being spoken about is cut off from context, unable to defend themselves, unaware they're even in the conversation. Relationships degrade, confusion spreads, the triangle holds. Emotionally, the impact on victims is profound. They often experience chronic self-doubt, paranoia, emotional isolation, anxiety and panic in social dynamics, deep, unnameable shame. Victims of triangulation often internalize the message that they are the problem, not realizing that the relationships around them have been poisoned from the outside in. They may begin to mistrust their own memories, intentions, and instincts. This is especially dangerous in romantic relationships, where triangulation can lead to long-term emotional trauma and even complex PTSD. In cults and authoritarian systems, triangulation is a core strategy. Leaders control dissent by ensuring that members are suspicious of each other. Loyalty is tested by forcing followers to report on one another. No one knows who's on whose side. This dynamic breaks unity, breeds dependency, and consolidates power. Isolation becomes a feature, not a bug. The same tactic plays out in political propaganda. Create an us and a them, then introduce a traitor in the ranks. Distrust flourishes. People turn on each other. And while they fight among themselves, the true manipulator stays safe, unseen, above it all. What makes triangulation so dangerous is its subtlety. It can be delivered with a smile, framed as concern, hidden inside a compliment or a whisper. But the goal is always separation, never healing. Breaking the cycle of triangulation requires brutal honesty and emotional maturity. Victims must refuse to engage in third-party conversations, confront manipulation directly, and reclaim their perception. In therapy, individuals are taught to recognize the triangulated dynamic and restore healthy two-person communication, the antidote to toxic three-way control. But often, the only real escape is distance. You cannot win a rigged game. And if someone builds their relationships on triangles, they do not want resolution. They want chaos they can control. Triangulation is not conflict resolution. It is conflict weaponization. A tool for control, not connection. In a world where communication should heal, triangulation turns it into a knife, not used to stab, but to sever. Splitting, all good or all evil, no in-between splitting, is a defense mechanism, a mental process in which a person divides the world into absolute categories, all good or all bad, hero or villain, angel or monster. It is black and white thinking pushed to its psychological extreme. There is no grey area, no nuance, no middle ground. People are either idealized or demonized, often flipping between the two, with no warning. In the dark corridors of psychology, splitting is known as one of the most destabilizing forces in human relationships. At its root, it is a survival strategy, an unconscious attempt to manage overwhelming emotions. But in practice, it can destroy trust, warp perception, and trap people in volatile, chaotic emotional cycles. Splitting is most commonly associated with borderline personality disorder, BPD, though it can appear in many people under stress, trauma, or emotional immaturity. It often begins in childhood, especially in environments marked by instability, neglect, or abuse. When a child cannot reconcile that the same caregiver who provides comfort is also the source of fear, the mind fractures that contradiction into two parts. The caregiver is either good or evil, never both. This is not a choice. It is a psychic defense, meant to protect a fragile self from cognitive and emotional overload. To hold conflicting truths, that someone loves you and hurts you, is excruciating. So the mind chooses simplicity over complexity, certainty over confusion. That's the origin of splitting. To cope, the mind chooses extremes. In adulthood, splitting often manifests in relationships. A person may see their partner as perfect, irreplaceable, sacred, until a perceived betrayal or slight sends them into rage or despair. The same partner becomes worthless, cruel, toxic, but then, just as quickly, they return to being adored. This emotional whiplash isn't manipulation in the traditional sense. It's a symptom of a fractured reality. Psychologically, splitting has been studied most extensively within the framework of borderline personality disorder, BPD, and is considered one of its core defense mechanisms. According to Otto Kernberg, a leading figure in psychoanalytic theory, splitting is part of what he described as a borderline personality organization, where the person cannot integrate opposing affective experiences. Kernberg argued that people with this internal structure form unstable self-images and interpersonal relationships because they fail to reconcile positive and negative feelings into a cohesive whole. Modern neuroimaging studies support this view. Research published in Biological Psychiatry and Neuropsychopharmacology shows that individuals prone to splitting, especially those with BPD, often exhibit hyperactivity in the amygdala, the brain's center for fear and emotional reactivity, coupled with reduced connectivity in the prefrontal cortex, which governs impulse control and rational thought. This imbalance means emotional triggers can hijack the brain before logic or empathy has time to intervene. The result is an experience of the world that constantly shifts between threat and safety, idealization and rejection, all governed by unfiltered emotion. Splitting turns others into symbols, not people. You are either a savior or a threat. And when someone who was once idealized inevitably disappoints, as all humans do, the split occurs. Suddenly, the person who was everything becomes nothing. This is why people who engage in splitting often experience intense, unstable relationships. Friendships dissolve over small disagreements. Lovers are idolized one week and hated the next. Therapists, teachers, parents, anyone in a position of perceived power can become targets of devaluation if they fail to live up to impossible expectations. In group psychology, splitting can be seen in cults, extremist ideologies, and high-control environments. Us versus them, pure versus corrupt, loyal versus traitorous. The world is divided into clean lines, and dissent becomes heresy. This isn't just belief. It's a psychological need for structure in an unpredictable world. Splitting can also be internally directed. A person may view themselves as either a complete failure or a total success. A single mistake becomes evidence of being worthless. One compliment may trigger feelings of grandiosity. There is no emotional continuity, just violent swings from one extreme to the other. Neurologically, splitting is linked to dysregulation of the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which processes fear and threat, and the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking. In individuals prone to splitting, emotional stimuli override logic. The brain reacts, not evaluates. One of the most destructive effects of splitting is that it erodes empathy. When someone is categorized as bad, they are stripped of nuance, context, and humanity. Their intentions don't matter. Their past kindness doesn't count. They are defined by their worst moment and punished accordingly. In romantic relationships, this leads to patterns of push and pull, often mistaken for passion. The intensity feels real, even addictive. But what's happening beneath the surface is emotional instability, driven by an inability to hold two opposing truths at once. That people can love and fail you, that flaws don't erase value. Victims of splitting often walk on eggshells, never sure which version of themselves their partner sees. Today, they are adored. Tomorrow, they are despised. It creates confusion, anxiety, and often deep emotional trauma. Over time, the unpredictability becomes a form of covert abuse, even if unintentional. In families, splitting can result in scapegoating, where one child is idealized and another demonized. In workplaces, it leads to favoritism, sabotage, and political maneuvering. In politics, splitting fuels tribalism, good citizens versus enemies of the state. But here's the darkest truth about splitting. It feels real. To the person experiencing it, their perception is absolute. In that moment, the emotional logic is airtight. You are either saving them or destroying them. There's no in-between. This is what makes splitting so hard to challenge. Logic doesn't work. Rational conversations feel like betrayal. Trying to offer balance, to say maybe it's more complicated, can trigger rage, paranoia, or withdrawal. Healing from splitting requires a return to complexity. This is not easy. The brain must learn to tolerate ambivalence, the idea that two opposing truths can exist at the same time. This demands emotional maturity, therapy, and often a painful confrontation with one's past. For those caught in a relationship with someone who splits, boundaries are essential. Clear communication, consistency, and emotional detachment are necessary to survive the chaos. But even then, it can be deeply draining. The opposite of splitting is integration. The ability to hold both good and bad in the same space, to accept that people are flawed, inconsistent, and human, that love can coexist with disappointment, that safety is not the absence of conflict, but the presence of trust. But integration requires a nervous system that can regulate, a mind that can reflect, and a heart that can withstand the discomfort of uncertainty. For those who have lived in emotional extremes, this kind of middle ground feels foreign, even dangerous. Yet it is the only way out. Because splitting is not just about others, it's about the self. The inability to reconcile complexity outside is a reflection of chaos within. The healing begins not with seeing others differently, but with seeing oneself as worthy of both compassion and correction, strength and struggle. Splitting may begin as a defense, but if left unchecked, it becomes a prison. Trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is a psychological phenomenon in which a strong emotional attachment forms between an abuser and their victim, fueled not by affection, but by cycles of abuse and intermittent reward. It is a paradox. The deeper the harm, the tighter the bond. This is not love. This is survival masquerading as connection. The term originates from studies of hostages and victims of long-term abuse, but its mechanisms can be found everywhere. In toxic relationships, manipulative families, cults, trafficking, and even military or workplace hierarchies. At its core, trauma bonding is about psychological entrapment, an invisible leash forged through fear, shame, hope, and control. The psychology behind trauma bonding is brutal in its simplicity. When someone alternates between cruelty and kindness, the brain enters a state of confusion. The same person who hurts you is also the one who soothes you. Over time, the nervous system becomes conditioned, desperate for the reward, terrified of the punishment, and unable to escape. It is classical conditioning mixed with emotional dependency. Trauma bonds form through a cycle. First, there's idealization, the honeymoon phase. The abuser showers the victim with affection, attention, and false promises. The connection feels intense, profound, fated. The victim becomes emotionally invested. Then comes devaluation. Subtle insults, emotional neglect, outbursts, withdrawal. Confusion sets in. The victim starts to chase the affection they once received. And then the abuser rewards them again, just enough to keep them hopeful. A soft apology, a tender moment, a fleeting smile. The reward never lasts, but it's enough to keep the victim holding on. The cycle repeats: idealization, devaluation, reward. Every loop strengthens the bond. The victim becomes emotionally entangled in a web of instability, convinced that they are the problem, and that if they just try harder, the love will return. But it doesn't. From a neurological perspective, trauma bonding hijacks the brain's dopamine system. The unpredictable highs and crushing lows mimic the effects of addictive substances. Like a gambler waiting for the next win, the victim stays, not because they're weak, but because they are chemically tethered to the possibility of relief. Over time, they stop seeking happiness. They just want the pain to stop. This is why people stay in abusive relationships. This is why victims defend their abusers. Not because they don't know the harm is happening, but because they've been conditioned to believe that harm is love. In many cases, trauma bonding is reinforced by isolation. The abuser encourages the victim to cut ties with friends, family, and support systems. Without an outside perspective, the victim begins to question their own judgment. Gaslighting, a common companion to trauma bonding, makes the victim doubt their memory, perception, and sanity. They begin to rely on the abuser for a sense of reality. Trauma bonds are especially strong in relationships where the abuse is intermittent. If abuse were constant, the mind might resist, rebel, escape. But the unpredictability, the sudden switch from violence to affection, creates a powerful reinforcement loop. The victim clings to the memory of who the abuser was during the good times and believes that person can return. But that person never truly existed. It was a mask. The effects of trauma bonding are profound. Victims often report feeling trapped, ashamed, confused, and emotionally numb. They may minimize the abuse, blame themselves, or even defend their abuser to others. The bond becomes a psychological cage, and the longer it lasts, the harder it is to break. Trauma bonds are not just emotional, they are physiological. The body becomes used to the adrenaline, the cortisol, the tension. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. Safety feels suspicious. Children raised in abusive homes often develop trauma bonds with neglectful or violent parents. They learn early on that love comes with pain, that comfort is temporary, and that their needs are dangerous. These patterns carry into adulthood, into romantic relationships, friendships, and even workplaces. The child becomes the adult who chases love that hurts. Trauma bonding is also heavily present in cult environments. Leaders isolate members, punish disobedience, and reward compliance. Public humiliation followed by private praise. Fear followed by forgiveness. Over time, members become emotionally dependent on the very people who harm them. Leaving feels not only impossible, it feels wrong. Victims of human trafficking often experience intense trauma bonding. Despite horrific abuse, they may feel loyalty or affection toward their captor. This is not weakness, it is psychological survival. When pain becomes your environment, your brain adapts. It learns to find meaning in cruelty and hope in the briefest kindness. One of the most disturbing aspects of trauma bonding is how it can mimic love. The intensity, the passion, the highs and lows, they all look like devotion to the untrained eye. Outsiders might even envy the connection, not realizing they're witnessing a bond built on fear and control. That's what makes trauma bonding so dangerous. It hides in plain sight. Breaking a trauma bond requires more than distance. It requires deprogramming. Therapy often begins by helping the victim name the abuse, identify the cycle, and build emotional distance from the abuser's voice. But even then, withdrawal symptoms can occur. Guilt, longing, grief. The bond doesn't disappear overnight. It dissolves slowly, layer by painful layer. Survivors often struggle with identity. Who are they without the abuser? Without the cycle? Many feel shame for having stayed or for still missing someone who hurt them. These are natural reactions. Trauma bonding conditions people not only to tolerate pain, but to expect it. The first step in healing is understanding that trauma bonding is not consent. It is not love. It is not mutual. It is a strategic entrapment of the mind and body, designed to keep the victim close and compliant. Trauma bonds can happen to anyone. Intelligence, strength, and awareness offer no guaranteed protection. All it takes is vulnerability, hope, and the right manipulator. But with time, support, and self-reclamation, the cycle can be broken. Because trauma is not love, and pain is not proof of loyalty. Fear conditioning. Fear conditioning is a form of psychological learning in which a person or animal begins to associate a neutral stimulus with something frightening or painful. Over time, the once innocent trigger, a sound, a place, a face, a smell, becomes enough to evoke intense fear, even if the threat is no longer present. This process is how the mind is trained to obey through terror. At its core, fear conditioning is about control. It is how predators, abusers, governments, and even everyday manipulators can hardwire fear into someone's psychology and make it automatic. The concept originates from classical conditioning, a discovery attributed to Ivan Pavlov in the early 20th century. But it was John B. Watson, an American psychologist, who in 1920 gave us one of the most disturbing early examples of fear conditioning. In the controversial Little Albert experiment, Watson exposed a baby to a white rat. Initially, the child showed no fear. But every time the rat appeared, Watson struck a metal bar behind the child's head, creating a loud, terrifying noise. After repeated pairings, the child began to cry at the mere sight of the rat, even in the absence of sound. Later, the child also began to fear similar stimuli: dogs, fur coats, even Santa Claus masks. One fear had spread into many. This experiment wasn't just unethical, it was revealing. It showed that fear can be taught and generalized. Once implanted, the conditioned fear spreads like a virus, and once rooted in the brain, it is resistant to logic, comfort, or reason. In modern psychology, fear conditioning is studied heavily in the context of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Victims of war, abuse, or accidents often experience irrational panic in response to innocuous cues, a slammed door, a flashing light, a specific scent. These triggers are not dangerous, but the brain, through conditioning, has marked them as threats. The fear feels real because the amygdala, the brain's fear center, does not distinguish between past trauma and present reality. Fear conditioning works by creating a link between stimulus and survival. If the brain believes that a certain stimulus precedes danger, it adapts. Faster heart rate, sweating, muscle tension, avoidance behaviors. The neural connection becomes reinforced every time fear is validated, and over time, the conditioned response becomes automatic. It's no longer a choice, it's a reflex. But in the wrong hands, this reflex becomes a weapon. Abusers, for example, use fear conditioning to maintain control. They don't need to hit every time. Sometimes a look is enough, a change in tone, a slammed door. Over time, the victim learns to anticipate pain, shame, or rage at the smallest signal. They become hyper-aware, cautious, submissive. The abusers successfully conditioned their behavior, not through constant violence, but through selective reinforcement of terror. This is also how governments and regimes control populations. Public punishments, sudden disappearances, censorship combined with propaganda. Over time, people learn to stay quiet, to avoid questions, to look away. Even when the punishments become rare, the fear remains. A glance at history, from Stalin's USSR to North Korea, shows us how entire societies can be programmed to flinch at certain ideas, names, or words. In cults, leaders often use fear of damnation, exile, or supernatural punishment to enforce obedience. Followers are taught that questioning the leader will lead to spiritual death, social rejection, or eternal suffering. These fears may seem irrational to outsiders, but inside the conditioned system they feel completely real. Fear becomes doctrine, compliance becomes automatic. And in relationships, fear conditioning can take a more subtle but equally insidious form. Imagine a partner who belittles you every time you express emotion. Eventually, you stop expressing emotion. Or a parent who withholds love whenever a child disagrees. The child stops disagreeing. This is how fear conditioning shapes identity itself, not just behavior. Neuroscience shows us that fear conditioning affects the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. The amygdala handles the emotional response, while the hippocampus logs the memory, and the prefrontal cortex normally regulates reactions. But in trauma, this regulatory function is overridden. The emotional brain becomes dominant. Once the fear circuit is active, the thinking brain is suppressed. The person becomes reactive, irrational, and highly suggestible. This is why media, too, can engage in subtle fear conditioning. Repeated exposure to frightening news, violent images, or moral panic can condition viewers to fear specific groups, ideologies, or behaviors, often irrationally. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Fear sells, fear controls, fear silences. Recovery from fear conditioning is not simple. The conditioned fear response can remain embedded in the nervous system for years, even a lifetime. Treatment often involves exposure therapy, in which the individual is slowly reintroduced to the trigger in a safe environment, allowing the brain to relearn that it is not in danger. But this process is slow, painful, and never guaranteed. What makes fear conditioning so dark is its invisible permanence. It changes how people see the world, it rewires behavior, and worse, it often convinces the victim that their fear is their own fault, that they are broken, weak, or paranoid. But the truth is that fear was implanted in them. It was taught, reinforced, and manipulated, often by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. This tactic also works hand in hand with other psychological manipulations: gaslighting, isolation, love bombing, and trauma bonding. Fear becomes the glue that holds the whole system together. It doesn't require chains or cages, just the right trigger, delivered at the right moment, over and over again. In the end, fear conditioning isn't just about fear, it's about obedience. The goal is not to terrify someone forever, it's to train them to stay in line, to stop asking questions, to shrink themselves before they're even told to. It is psychological captivity, and it works. Learned helplessness. Learned helplessness is a psychological condition in which a person comes to believe they are powerless to change their circumstances, even when opportunities for escape or improvement exist. Over time, after repeated exposure to uncontrollable, negative experiences, the individual stops trying to avoid the harm. They accept suffering as inevitable. The mind is conditioned to believe there is no escape. The concept was first identified in the 1960s by psychologists Martin Seligman and Stephen Meyer. In a now infamous experiment, they subjected dogs to a series of electric shocks. Some dogs were able to stop the shocks by pressing a panel, while others had no control. Later, when all the dogs were placed in a new setting where escape was easy, by simply jumping over a low barrier, the ones who had learned they were helpless didn't even try. They lay down, whimpered, and accepted the pain. This chilling study became a cornerstone of behavioral psychology and trauma theory. What it revealed was unsettling. The human mind, much like the animal brain, can be trained to surrender. Once a person internalizes that their actions are meaningless, they stop resisting. Not because they are weak, but because they've learned that resistance is pointless. In real life, learned helplessness manifests in abuse victims, prisoners, children raised in toxic households, workers in oppressive jobs, and people suffering from chronic poverty or discrimination. Over time, they may stop seeking help, opportunities, or change, even when those options are available. Their psychological framework tells them, nothing you do will matter. Psychologically, this state is rooted in perceived control. When individuals believe they have no control over outcomes, especially in situations involving pain, failure, or humiliation, their motivation, self-esteem, and decision-making all deteriorate. They stop trying not because they've analyzed and chosen passivity, but because their nervous system has been conditioned to avoid disappointment. The expectation of failure becomes a permanent lens. The consequences go beyond just passivity. Learned helplessness leads to chronic stress, depression, anxiety, and a breakdown in executive function. The individual loses the ability to plan, adapt, or act, even when the situation changes. The trauma continues, even when the threat is gone. This psychological trap is particularly common in domestic abuse. A victim who tries to leave and is punished, shamed, or dragged back eventually learns to stay. They stop reaching out. They make excuses. It's not that bad. I deserved it. No one will believe me. These aren't just rationalizations. They are survival mechanisms. The same dynamic exists in child abuse, where the child internalizes their powerlessness and often grows into an adult who repeats the same relational patterns. Educational failure is another area where learned helplessness emerges. A child who is constantly told they are stupid, or who fails repeatedly despite effort, may stop trying altogether. Even when they gain new resources or support, they may not believe they can succeed. The damage has already been done, not to their intellect, but to their self-concept. In workplace environments, toxic management styles can condition employees to suppress initiative. Constant criticism, lack of autonomy, and punitive leadership can create a culture where workers stop innovating, asking questions, or speaking up. Even when the toxic leader is replaced, the culture of helplessness lingers. On a broader scale, entire populations can fall into learned helplessness. In authoritarian regimes, people may initially resist censorship, corruption, and violence. But as protests are crushed, dissent punished, and truth obscured, the population may slowly grow numb. Eventually, apathy sets in, not because people agree with the system, but because they no longer believe they can change it. Tyranny thrives not only through force, but through the learned despair of the people. What makes learned helplessness particularly dark is its invisibility. From the outside, the victim often looks lazy, passive, or indifferent. They may be judged harshly, but underneath, their nervous system has been wired for surrender. Their body is in a constant state of suppression, suppressing hope, action, and even thought. Manipulators, abusers, and cult leaders understand this, often instinctively. They create patterns of intermittent abuse and reward, blurring the lines between control and care. Over time, the victim forgets what freedom even looks like. The cage becomes home. They might even defend their captor, a phenomenon closely tied to Stockholm Syndrome, which often coexists with learned helplessness. In high-control cults or militant groups, leaders isolate individuals, bombard them with contradictory messages, and punish deviation. As the individual loses the ability to predict outcomes, their sense of agency erodes. Eventually, the follower accepts whatever they're told, not because they believe, but because belief no longer matters. The mind has shut down the need to question. Neurologically, learned helplessness is associated with changes in the limbic system, particularly the amygdala, which governs fear response, and the prefrontal cortex, responsible for rational thought and decision-making. Chronic exposure to uncontrollable stress floods the body with cortisol, damaging neural pathways and impairing judgment. It is not just psychological, it is neurochemical suppression. This condition is difficult to reverse. Recovery from learned helplessness requires retraining the mind to believe in agency. This involves small, consistent experiences of control, choice, and positive reinforcement. Therapy must address both the trauma and the belief system that grew around it. Otherwise, the person may remain stuck, physically free but mentally imprisoned. In the modern digital world, learned helplessness is subtly reinforced. Algorithms feed users content that confirms despair, news of corruption, injustice, climate doom. Social platforms bombard users with problems they can't solve, creating a sense of collective futility. Why bother becomes a default emotion. This digital fatigue numbs critical thinking and action, and in that vacuum, control flourishes. Learned helplessness is not rare, it is everywhere, hidden behind apathy, depression, and compliance. It is the quiet resignation of millions, and because it masquerades as laziness or weakness, it often goes untreated, unrecognized, even encouraged by those in power. Understanding this phenomenon is essential not just for therapy or rehabilitation, but for resistance. Because the first step in control is to teach the victim that they have no power, and the first step in liberation is to remind them that they do. Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome is a psychological response wherein hostages or abuse victims develop positive feelings, emotional attachment, or even loyalty toward their captors or abusers. This reaction often occurs despite the danger, fear, or abuse endured, and can manifest as sympathy, affection, or identification with the aggressor. The term was coined in 1973 after a failed bank robbery in Stockholm, Sweden. 2 criminals held 4 bank employees hostage for 6 days inside a vault. During this time, the captives began to show surprising signs of emotional closeness to their captors. They defended them after release, refused to testify against them in court, and even raised money for their legal defense. Police and psychologists were baffled. The victims' their behavior defied logic, and yet it was real. This strange phenomenon was later named Stockholm Syndrome by criminologist Nils Bejerot, who assisted Swedish police during the standoff. But while the name is relatively modern, the psychological mechanisms behind it are ancient and primal. At the core of Stockholm Syndrome is trauma bonding, a survival response to intense emotional and physical captivity. When a victim is isolated, deprived of autonomy, and placed under the total control of another person, especially someone who alternates between cruelty and kindness, the brain shifts into self-preservation mode. It begins to seek any path to reduce fear, pain, or uncertainty. One of the mind's most effective defenses in such situations is emotional realignment. If the captor becomes the only source of food, water, warmth, or mercy, the brain begins to perceive them not just as a threat, but as a lifeline. This is not a conscious decision. It is an unconscious cognitive distortion, a neurological adaptation to unbearable stress. Stockholm Syndrome can occur in various contexts: hostage situations, abusive relationships, cults, child abuse, sex trafficking, and even authoritarian environments. In each case, the victim becomes emotionally tethered to their abuser, not out of love, but out of a desperate need to survive. Psychologically, the syndrome is driven by several powerful forces. Intermittent reinforcement. When abusers alternate between punishment and affection, the victim becomes addicted to the moments of perceived kindness. The unpredictability of reward makes the bond stronger, similar to the psychological mechanics of gambling. Power imbalance. In situations where the victim is entirely dependent on the captor, a reversal of empathy occurs. The victim begins to see the world from the abuser's perspective, even to the point of excusing their actions or blaming themselves. Isolation. Without access to external reality, support systems, or alternative viewpoints, the victim's only psychological reference point becomes the abuser. This creates a mental echo chamber where manipulation thrives unchecked. Fear of escalation. Victims often believe that resistance will only provoke more violence. Submission and emotional compliance become tools for survival, leading to emotional entrapment. Neurologically, this can be seen as a severe disruption in the amygdala and hypothalamus, regions of the brain responsible for emotional regulation, fear processing, and stress response. In prolonged trauma, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for logic and long-term planning, can shut down, making rational evaluation of the situation nearly impossible. The result is a paradox. The more pain the victim experiences, the deeper the emotional bond may grow, because the mind must justify why it hasn't escaped. If I still care about them, maybe this isn't abuse. If they were really evil, why did they show me mercy? These internal negotiations aren't conscious lies. They are survival mechanisms. Stockholm Syndrome is not officially recognized as a diagnosable disorder in the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, but it is widely acknowledged in forensic psychology, trauma studies, and crisis negotiation training. Law enforcement officers and hostage negotiators are trained to recognize the symptoms when victims start defending their captors, when they resist rescue, or when they express guilt for betraying the abuser. But the syndrome isn't limited to extreme hostage scenarios. In domestic abuse, victims often stay with their abusers for years, defending them to friends and family, believing they are at fault or convincing themselves that things will change. The fear of being alone, of retaliation, or of losing one's identity becomes more terrifying than the abuse itself. Cult leaders also exploit this effect. By isolating followers, destroying their sense of autonomy, and creating cycles of fear and reward, they manufacture deep loyalty. Followers may endure public humiliation, financial ruin, or even physical harm, yet continue to believe that the leader cares for them. Stockholm Syndrome becomes a lever of total psychological control. The syndrome has even been used in warfare and espionage. During the Korean War, some American POWs defected to the enemy, not because of ideology, but because they developed attachments to their captors under conditions of starvation, isolation, and brainwashing. The mind seeks order in chaos, even if that order is manufactured by a captor. In the world of human trafficking, Stockholm Syndrome is tragically common. Victims, often abducted or coerced, may form emotional bonds with their traffickers, defending them, refusing to escape even when offered help, and sometimes returning to them voluntarily. Traffickers exploit this bond by offering brief moments of affection, gifts, or emotional validation, intertwined with brutal control. What makes Stockholm Syndrome particularly insidious is that it doesn't feel like madness to the victim. It feels like clarity. It feels like relief. In their world of trauma, the captor becomes a symbol of stability. Their voice becomes soothing. Their presence is familiar. Escape isn't just difficult, it becomes unthinkable. This makes intervention complex. Victims may resist counseling, refuse help, or turn against those trying to rescue them. The emotional grip of Stockholm Syndrome is not easily broken. Recovery involves re-establishing autonomy, rebuilding identity, and slowly confronting the reality of the abuse, a painful process that can take months or years. The darker truth is that anyone is susceptible under the right conditions. Stockholm Syndrome is not a sign of weakness or stupidity. It is a predictable human response to prolonged psychological terror. Under enough stress, isolation, and fear, even the strongest minds can fracture and reshape themselves to survive. Understanding Stockholm Syndrome is not just about hostage negotiation or criminal psychology. It is about recognizing how fragile the human mind becomes under coercion. It is about understanding how love can be weaponized, how empathy can be twisted, and how the will to live can quietly become a will to submit. Isolation as a control mechanism. Isolation is one of the most effective tools of psychological control. It is not just the absence of others, it is the deliberate removal of connection, support, and external influence. When used as a manipulation tactic, isolation becomes a weapon. It doesn't just confine the body, it imprisons the mind. In its simplest form, isolation strips a person of their ability to compare, question, or escape. Without contact with the outside world, the victim can no longer rely on other perspectives, norms, or sources of truth. Reality becomes whatever the controller says it is. Historically, isolation has always been used as a method of punishment, interrogation, and indoctrination. In solitary confinement, prisoners often begin to hallucinate, regress, or lose their grip on time and identity. In cults, followers are often encouraged to abandon their families, cut ties with friends, or reject anyone who doesn't believe. In abusive relationships, isolation begins subtly. A jealous partner questions your friends, criticizes your family, and insists that only they truly understand you. Then slowly, your world shrinks. The purpose is always the same, to weaken resistance. When a person is isolated, their emotional and psychological resilience erodes. Human beings are social creatures. We regulate our emotions through contact, through sharing, validating, witnessing. Without that, thoughts spiral, self-worth collapses, and the manipulator becomes the only voice left in the room. The psychology behind isolation is rooted in dependency and distortion. A person cut off from external input becomes increasingly dependent on the isolator, not just for company, but for truth. What's real? What's normal? What's acceptable? The isolated person no longer knows. And when uncertainty sets in, people stop pushing back. They comply to survive. The tactic of isolation is rarely blunt. It doesn't always start with locked doors or explicit commands. Instead, it begins with subtle sabotage. The manipulator might create doubt. Why do you still talk to them? They don't really care about you. Or guilt. I just want to spend more time with you, but you're always with them. Or even manufactured conflict. Your friends are jealous. They don't want us to be happy. Little by little, contact with the outside world is reduced, not through force, but through emotional manipulation. And eventually, when the victim needs help most, there's no one left to call. In domestic abuse, this pattern is textbook. Isolation makes it harder for the victim to seek help, compare their experience to others, or even recognize that abuse is occurring. Without contrast, abnormal becomes normal. Pain becomes expected, and silence becomes survival. In workplace abuse, isolation can take the form of exclusion. A toxic boss might isolate a target by excluding them from meetings, withholding information, or fostering distrust among team members. The individual becomes alienated, unsupported and vulnerable, more easily manipulated or forced out without protest. Cults and extremist groups rely heavily on isolation. Members are cut off from previous lives, and communication with outsiders is discouraged or punished. In high-control religions, questioning authority is treated as rebellion. Doubts must be confessed, not discussed. Followers are often surrounded only by others who share the same beliefs, reinforcing the illusion that their worldview is absolute. This echo chamber strengthens the leader's power and makes dissent feel impossible. Even in modern digital culture, isolation is becoming more sophisticated. Social algorithms feed us content that confirms our biases, separating us from opposing viewpoints. Online grooming, particularly in radicalization or trafficking, often starts with emotional manipulation and escalates to isolation from friends and family. The internet gives predators direct access to vulnerable individuals, often without anyone in their life noticing the shift until it's too late. Isolation also plays a crucial role in gaslighting. When someone is isolated, it's easier to distort their perception of events. There are no witnesses, no one to say, that's not what happened. And so the victim starts to doubt their memory, their judgment, and eventually their sanity. They begin to rely on the abuser for reality itself. Neurologically, isolation increases levels of cortisol, the stress hormone, and reduces the production of oxytocin, which is involved in bonding and emotional regulation. Chronic isolation leads to anxiety, depression, and cognitive decline. Over time, the brain becomes less capable of emotional resilience, which is exactly what the controller wants. What makes isolation especially insidious is that it can look like love. A partner who demands all your time might seem passionate at first. A leader who discourages doubt might seem strong. A group that claims outsiders are dangerous might seem protective. But in every case, the result is the same. Fewer options, fewer voices, fewer ways out. And once someone is isolated, obedience follows. With no one else to consult, the victim begins to accept unacceptable conditions. They stay silent. They stop resisting. They adapt, not because they agree, but because they are alone. Recovery from isolation is difficult. The first challenge is recognizing that isolation has occurred. It's hard to know you've been cut off when you've been trained to believe that everyone else is the problem. Rebuilding connection takes time, especially when trust has been broken. The victim must relearn how to speak, how to trust, how to ask for help, and most importantly, how to disagree. In therapy, isolation is often the first layer to be addressed. Without community, healing is nearly impossible. Support groups, friendships, mentors, these connections begin to counter the voice of the manipulator. But for many, the path back to connection is filled with fear, shame, and uncertainty. They've been taught that the outside world is dangerous, that no one will believe them, that leaving will bring punishment. And these beliefs don't just vanish overnight. Societally, isolation is used as a means of population control. Divide and conquer, separate people by ideology, race, class, or belief, and they become easier to manipulate. Loneliness is not just a symptom of modern life, it's a tactic, and its effects are measurable. Worse health, shorter lifespans, increased compliance. Isolation doesn't break people with violence, it breaks them with silence. Love bombing. Love bombing is a psychological manipulation tactic in which an individual overwhelms someone with excessive affection, attention, flattery, gifts, and praise in order to gain control over them. On the surface, it may seem like intense romantic interest, kindness, or genuine admiration, but at its core, love bombing is a calculated strategy designed to disarm critical thinking and create emotional dependence. It is not about love. It is about control. The term originated in the 1970s, not from psychology initially, but from the world of cult indoctrination. Leaders of extremist groups would deliberately shower new recruits with affection, approval, and belonging. The tactic was used by groups like the Unification Church, which explicitly referred to their method of recruiting as love bombing. Newcomers were flooded with validation and emotional warmth, making them feel special, chosen, seen. Once emotionally hooked, they were more likely to submit to group doctrine and abandon their former lives. Psychologists later adopted the term to describe similar behavior patterns found in abusive romantic relationships and narcissistic dynamics. In these contexts, love bombing is used to bypass emotional defenses, to make a person feel so adored, so cherished, that they stop asking questions, stop seeing red flags, and begin to lower their boundaries. The technique is especially effective because it exploits deep human needs, the desire to be loved, seen, accepted, and emotionally secure. The early stages of love bombing feel euphoric. The victim is told they are perfect, that no one has ever loved like this before. They're called soulmates. The connection is described as fate. They receive constant messages, physical closeness, extravagant promises, or even premature commitments like talks of marriage or shared futures, all within days or weeks of meeting. This intensity is mistaken for passion. But what's really happening is emotional hijacking. Psychologically, love bombing triggers a cascade of neurochemical reactions. The victim's brain floods with dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin, creating a feeling of elation, bonding, and trust. It becomes addictive, and that's by design. The love bomber is deliberately creating a dependency cycle. The victim becomes emotionally invested in the high, making them vulnerable to what comes next, devaluation and control. Because once the bond is formed, the dynamic shifts, the compliments stop. The affection becomes conditional. The love bomber begins to pull away, subtly at first, then more forcefully. The same person who couldn't stop texting suddenly goes silent. The one who promised eternal devotion now criticizes, withdraws, or punishes. This withdrawal triggers anxiety in the victim, who begins to chase the affection they once received. The relationship becomes imbalanced, with one person constantly trying to earn back the love that was given so freely before. This is where love bombing turns sinister. What started as romance becomes emotional captivity. The abuser controls when affection is given and when it is withheld. The victim is caught in a psychological loop. They remember the overwhelming love and believe that if they just behave the right way, say the right things, or avoid conflict, that love will return. But it never truly does. The warmth becomes a tool of punishment and reward. This pattern is common in relationships involving narcissists, sociopaths, and emotional abusers. Love bombing is often the first phase in a cycle that includes idealization, devaluation, and eventually discard. In the beginning, the abuser mirrors the victim's values, interests, and desires, creating the illusion of perfect compatibility. This mirroring, combined with flattery and fast-tracked intimacy, bypasses natural trust building and speeds the emotional bonding process. The victim feels like they've found someone who understands them completely, but it's all strategic. Behind the scenes, the love bomber is collecting information. They're learning the victim's insecurities, desires, triggers, and fears. This knowledge becomes a weapon. Once the victim is emotionally attached, those very same vulnerabilities are used to manipulate, gaslight, or guilt-trip them. The affection that once felt like safety becomes a chain. Love bombing doesn't just happen in romantic relationships. It's also used in friendships, workplaces, and even politics. A manipulative boss may praise an employee excessively, offer mentorship, or promise advancement, only to later exploit their loyalty. A political figure may appeal to the public with charismatic charm, national pride, or promises of protection, only to erode civil liberties once loyalty is secured. The emotional dependency created by love bombing works across all forms of power imbalance. Victims of love bombing often struggle to recognize what has happened. The early phase felt so good, so affirming, that the brain resists the idea that it was a trap. Survivors may blame themselves, wondering if they were too needy, too sensitive, or too demanding. They may return to the abuser repeatedly, hoping to restore the original affection. This is not weakness. It's neurochemical addiction mixed with psychological grooming. What's especially dark about love bombing is how it weaponizes affection. It turns love, something that should be safe and mutual, into a tool of conquest. The abuser doesn't just want affection in return. They want control, obedience, validation. And once they have it, the victim becomes disposable. In therapy, recovering from love bombing involves more than just walking away. It requires rebuilding trust in oneself, relearning healthy boundaries, and coming to terms with the fact that not all love is real. Survivors often describe it as emotional whiplash. The contrast between the high of the bombing phase and the pain of the manipulation is so extreme, it leaves deep psychological scars. Some never trust easily again. It's also important to recognize that love bombing is not always intentional. Some people love bomb out of insecurity, trauma, or abandonment issues, seeking connection too quickly, fearing rejection, and overcompensating with intensity. But whether the intent is malicious or unconscious, the effects are the same: distorted reality, emotional dependency, and eventual harm. In an era of instant gratification and hyperconnectivity, love bombing has become more common and more insidious. Social media platforms allow manipulators to flood timelines with praise, emojis, attention, and flattery. Dating apps enable rapid-fire soulmate encounters, and people, often desperate for connection, are more susceptible than ever to the illusion of perfect love at first sight. The antidote is awareness. Real love takes time. It builds slowly, with respect, boundaries, and honesty. It doesn't rush, it doesn't smother, and it doesn't vanish the moment you ask questions. If affection feels too perfect, too fast, too intense, it might not be love. It might be the beginning of control. The foot-in-the-door technique, consent by corrosion. The foot-in-the-door technique is a psychological manipulation strategy where a small, seemingly harmless request is made first to increase the likelihood that a much larger, more significant request will be accepted later. At its core, it is a gradual erosion of resistance, not through force, but through compliance disguised as agreement. This technique is not new. It's rooted in behavioral psychology and was first studied in the 1960s by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, two social psychologists. In one of their classic experiments, they asked homeowners to display a small innocuous sticker in their windows promoting safe driving. A few weeks later, the same researchers returned, this time asking those same homeowners to put a large, obtrusive billboard in their yard for the same cause. The results were striking. People who had agreed to the small request were more than twice as likely to comply with the large one. Why? Because saying yes once changes how we see ourselves. Once we accept the label of being helpful, cooperative, or agreeable, we're more likely to continue acting in ways that are consistent with that identity. This is called self-perception theory. Our minds prefer internal harmony. If we comply once, even in a small way, we feel a subtle pressure to stay consistent with that image, and that internal pressure can be weaponized. The foot-in-the-door technique is not just a sales trick. It is a manipulator's gateway drug. Used ethically, it's a tool of persuasion. Used unethically, it's the slow undoing of boundaries. In abusive relationships, it often begins with small compromises. Can you just stop texting them as much? Why not cancel that plan? Just tonight? It's not a big deal, just don't wear that around my friends. Each request seems minor, defensible, harmless. But over time, they stack. What once seemed absurd becomes normalized. The victim doesn't notice the shift, because it happened inch by inch, not all at once. By the time the requests become outrageous, resistance feels unnatural, even disloyal. That's how control sets in. In cults and high-demand groups, the technique is ritualized. First, you're asked to attend a meeting. Then you're asked to volunteer. Then donate. Then isolate from outsiders. Each step justified. Each action connected to the last. Until finally, your life is no longer your own. It's not force. It's momentum. This is the brilliance and the horror of the foot-in-the-door technique. It doesn't just convince you to act. It reconstructs your identity along the way. You're not just doing what they ask. You're becoming who they want. In psychology, this method is linked to the consistency principle, one of the most powerful forces in human behavior. As outlined by Dr. Theon Robert Cialdini in his landmark book Influence, people strive to behave in ways that align with their previous actions and beliefs, even when those beliefs were artificially shaped. This is why cults start with community service. Why scams begin with a free gift. Why political extremists don't recruit with hate, but with shared frustrations. They don't need your full commitment right away. They just need your first yes. Even governments have used this tactic to devastating effect. Totalitarian regimes often begin their control not with violence, but with compliance. Citizens are asked to report minor infractions, to wear a badge, to repeat a phrase, small actions that slowly condition obedience. By the time the real demands come, the ones that strip autonomy, humanity, or safety, the population has already internalized the belief that compliance is safety. In social settings, the technique is disarmingly common. A stranger asks for directions, then asks for a ride. A coworker asks for feedback, then asks for help with their work. A friend vents about their problems, then subtly manipulates your emotional labor. It's not always malicious, but when it is, the pattern is the same. Start small, build trust, extract more. In marketing, the foot-in-the-door technique is industry standard. Free trials lead to subscriptions. Just one click becomes recurring charges. Sign up with your email leads to targeted psychological profiling. Consumers feel like they're making choices, but they're following a trail laid by behavioral scientists trained in incremental persuasion. This tactic is especially effective when the victim is emotionally vulnerable. People going through grief, trauma, loneliness, or fear are more likely to comply with initial requests, not because they're weak, but because they crave connection, meaning, or resolution, and manipulators know exactly how to mirror those needs. The technique also thrives in online environments where social proof and digital design are engineered to make each click feel casual. But in reality, every click is a commitment, a step deeper into a funnel of influence. What begins as curiosity ends in addiction, radicalization, or exploitation. What makes the foot-in-the-door technique so insidious is its subtlety. There's no single moment where the victim loses control. Instead, control is never taken. It's volunteered bit by bit, and that makes it harder to escape. Victims often blame themselves. I agreed to it. I didn't say no. I thought I was doing the right thing. By the time they realize the pattern, their own choices have been used against them. This is what makes the technique so dangerous. It builds compliance through complicity. Escaping the trap requires a painful confrontation with one's own decisions, recognizing not just the manipulator's tactics but one's own vulnerability to them, and that takes courage. It's far easier to deny, to minimize, or to double down on the pattern than it is to break it. But break it you must. Because the longer you walk down the path of incremental compliance, the harder it becomes to remember where you started or who you were before the first yes. The only real defense against the foot-in-the-door technique is awareness. Understanding that every small agreement is a doorway, and behind some doors there is nothing but darkness. So the next time someone asks you for a favor, a moment, a harmless little compromise, ask yourself, is this truly about the request, or is it about where it's meant to lead? Because the most dangerous manipulations don't begin with control, they begin with consent. The door-in-the-face technique. The door-in-the-face technique is a psychological manipulation strategy that begins not with persuasion, but with deliberate rejection. A large, unreasonable request is made first, fully expecting the other person to say no. Then a much smaller, more reasonable request follows. And because it feels like a concession, the second request is far more likely to be accepted. It's not negotiation, it's priming. A setup dressed as a compromise. The name comes from the image of someone metaphorically slamming a door in your face, rejecting the initial outrageous ask, only to open it moments later for something that feels far more acceptable. But what most people don't realize is this. The second request was always the real goal. The first one was bait. This technique was formally studied in 1975 by social psychologists Robert Cialdini, Vincent Vincent, Jerry Markal, and Randall R. Rhodes. In a landmark experiment, researchers asked strangers if they would be willing to volunteer for a massive commitment, like mentoring troubled youth for 2 years. Nearly everyone declined. Then they followed up by asking if the person would be willing to chaperone a single field trip instead. The result? Compliance rates more than doubled compared to when the smaller request was made on its own. Why? Because people are wired to seek balance. If you say no to someone, especially someone who seems sincere, you feel tension, guilt, discomfort, a need to make up for it. The second request becomes a release valve for that discomfort. It lets you say yes without losing face. It feels like you're being kind, reasonable, fair, but you're not choosing freely. You're being emotionally manipulated. The door-in-the-face technique leverages a concept known in psychology as reciprocal concessions. The idea that when someone appears to compromise, we feel obligated to meet them halfway. But in this context, the compromise is an illusion. The manipulator never expected you to agree to the first ask. It was designed to be rejected, so the second ask could slide in as the reasonable option. In business, this tactic is rampant. A contractor quotes an inflated price. When the client refuses, the discounted offer suddenly appears, which still profits the seller far more than fair market value. Or a software company offers a bloated, overpriced subscription only to downgrade you to the real target once you push back. It feels like you've won. But the game was rigged from the start. In personal relationships, this technique shows up in darker, more emotional ways. A partner demands a huge sacrifice, moving cities, cutting off a friend, changing careers. When you resist, they settle for a lesser demand. But the new request still crosses your boundaries, it still moves the line. And yet, you agree, because it feels better than what was first asked, because it feels like compromise. But in truth, it's compliance by contrast. Over time, the pattern compounds. Each no becomes a tool to pull you into a yes. The manipulator tests limits by starting too far, only to dial back just enough to make you feel like you're still in control. You're not. In sales, politics, religion, and power structures, this method is foundational. Governments float extreme policy ideas to gauge public reaction. When outrage follows, they retreat to a less extreme version, which was always the intended policy. And the public, feeling relieved, accepts it, not realizing they were just conditioned to accept what they would have rejected had it been the only offer. This is the core of the door-in-the-face technique, distorting your sense of scale. When you hear a ridiculous demand first, everything after it feels mild by comparison. You're no longer evaluating the request on its own merits. You're measuring it against an artificial extreme. This is how people lose themselves. Not through direct control, but through shifting frames. In families, this might look like a parent demanding absolute obedience, then compromising by letting you choose between two controlled options. In cults, it looks like isolation from the world, followed by carefully rationed freedoms that feel like kindness. In toxic friendships, it's constant guilt-tripping, followed by brief moments of approval. Each time, the manipulator engineers the contrast, and you mistake it for mercy. Neurologically, this technique plays on our brain's tendency toward anchoring. a cognitive bias where the first piece of information we receive serves as a reference point for all that follows. It's not rational, it's automatic. Once the anchor is set, our perceptions are skewed. We no longer judge fairly, we judge relatively. This is why scam artists start with outrageous claims before offering their normal pitch. It's why abusers escalate threats, then back off just enough to seem calm. And it's why high-control leaders make sweeping demands before settling into what they really wanted all along. Control isn't taken, it's negotiated, on their terms. One of the most insidious elements of the door-in-the-face technique is that it creates the illusion of your own autonomy. You said no, you felt empowered, then you said yes and felt balanced. But in reality, you were nudged every step of the way. Not by truth, but by strategy. That's the danger. When this method is used ethically, in therapy, behavior change, or diplomacy, it can build bridges. But when used manipulatively, it becomes a tool of coercion hidden in courtesy. Victims often don't realize what happened until much later. They replay the conversation, the requests, the choices. It all seemed fair, didn't it? But something feels off. The deal was never really a deal. It was a setup. Awareness is your only protection. When someone makes an extreme request, don't just breathe a sigh of relief when they offer a milder one. Ask, was this the plan from the start? When something feels like a concession, ask yourself, is this truly compromise, or is it manipulation disguised as generosity? Because in the wrong hands, a reasonable request is just a weapon sharpened by your own sense of fairness. And if you're not careful, you'll spend your life agreeing to things you never wanted, because they always seemed better than the alternative. The halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias, a flaw in perception where our judgment of one trait influences how we view unrelated traits. When someone appears attractive, confident, or likable in one area, we subconsciously assume they are good in others. Kind, honest, intelligent, capable. But that assumption is often false. This illusion of goodness, this glowing psychological halo, blinds us. It makes us ignore red flags. It makes us elevate the wrong people. And in some cases, it makes us hand our trust, our loyalty, even our safety, to the most dangerous ones. The term halo effect was first coined by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920. In his study, military officers were asked to rate their soldiers on various traits: physical appearance, intelligence, leadership, character. Thorndike noticed something troubling. If a soldier was considered physically attractive or well-liked, they received high marks across all categories, even without evidence to support it. Thorndike called this a constant error in psychological ratings, a flaw not in the subject, but in the observer. Decades of research have since confirmed what Thorndike first suspected. Humans do not see others clearly. We project goodness onto those who simply look the part. This is not just limited to physical beauty. A deep voice, symmetrical features, an expensive suit, a confident tone, all of these can create the illusion of competence and virtue, even when none exists. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner and expert on cognitive bias, described the halo effect as one of the most powerful mental shortcuts in human reasoning. It allows us to make fast judgments, but those judgments are often fatally flawed. Consider how often charm is mistaken for integrity, or how often leadership roles are given not to the most capable, but to the most charismatic. The halo effect doesn't just influence who we admire, it influences who we forgive. In courtrooms, studies have shown that attractive defendants are more likely to receive lenient sentences. Teachers grade attractive students more favorably. Employers choose charismatic applicants, even when their qualifications are weaker. We trust the wrong people for all the wrong reasons, and sometimes we suffer for it. In relationships, the halo effect becomes especially destructive. The perfect partner, the golden friend, the parent everyone thinks is a saint. On the surface, they shine. Behind closed doors, it's a different story. Abuse is often hidden beneath charm, manipulation beneath confidence, narcissism behind intelligence. And because the world sees only the halo, victims are often not believed. This effect explains how predators thrive, how cult leaders, corrupt politicians, and abusive partners can maintain loyalty, even after they've done irreparable harm. The public sees the glow, not the shadow it casts. And it doesn't stop with individuals. The halo effect extends to brands, organizations, even ideas. A company with a slick image is assumed to be ethical. A cause backed by a celebrity is seen as noble. A message delivered in a polished voice carries more weight, even if it's built on lies. The halo effect is not about the truth. It's about perception. And perception, once formed, is hard to break. In psychological terms, the halo effect is a heuristic, a mental shortcut. It reduces cognitive load by allowing us to categorize people quickly. But like most shortcuts, it comes with a cost. It reinforces stereotypes, it creates blind spots, and it gives power to those who know how to exploit it. Marketers, politicians, cult leaders, they all understand the halo effect. They don't need to be good. They just need to look good, and the public will do the rest. Our minds will fill in the gaps with assumptions. He must be smart, she must be kind. They must be right, and in doing so we surrender discernment. Neurologically, this effect is tied to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, a region associated with emotional judgment. When we evaluate people based on vibes, this area lights up, blending logic with emotion, making it difficult to separate the two. Our brains literally blur the lines between appearance and reality. This is why the halo effect is so dangerous. It feels true, and that feeling overrides facts. In social groups, this bias becomes tribal. The leader is good, the outsider is suspect. Nuance disappears, dissent is punished, loyalty becomes blindness, and those who question the glow are labeled bitter, jealous, or disloyal. Victims of the halo effect often question their own reality. Am I the problem? Everyone else thinks he's amazing. In toxic relationships, this leads to gaslighting, self-doubt, and emotional paralysis. If everyone loves the person who's hurting you, it becomes almost impossible to leave, or to even name what's happening. In systems of power, corporations, churches, governments, the halo effect can protect the worst offenders. Scandals get buried, warnings get ignored, and harm continues behind a wall of public admiration. Because if someone shines brightly enough, we stop asking questions. But the truth about the halo effect is this: it only works when people don't look deeper. It thrives on passivity, on comfort, on the desire to believe in goodness without evidence. To resist it is to embrace discomfort, to admit that someone you admire might be deeply flawed. That charm is not virtue. That goodness is not always visible. It takes discipline to see clearly, to ask who benefits from this perception. What am I not seeing? What truths are being hidden by beauty, status, or polish? Because behind every halo there is a human being, and humans, all of us, are capable of darkness. The halo effect is not just a cognitive bias. It is a psychological illusion with real consequences. It shapes who we trust, who we follow, and who we protect. It is not neutral. It decides outcomes, it writes narratives, and it hides truth. So the next time someone seems flawless, perfect, untouchable, pause. Look closer. Not everything that shines is gold. Emotional blackmail. Emotional blackmail is not a raised voice. It's not a demand shouted across a room. It is quieter than that, more intimate. It doesn't come in the form of threat, not at first, but as guilt, obligation, and fear. It's when someone uses your feelings against you to control you. It is love turned into a weapon. At its core, emotional blackmail is a psychological manipulation tactic in which someone exploits your emotional bonds to force compliance. If you really loved me, you'd do this. I can't believe you'd hurt me like this. Don't make me do something I'll regret. The words vary, the tone shifts, but the underlying message remains. You are responsible for my emotions, and I will punish you with them. The term was popularized by psychotherapist Susan Forward in her groundbreaking 1997 book, Emotional Blackmail, when the people in your life use fear, obligation, and guilt to manipulate you. She described it with chilling clarity, a manipulative cycle built on fog, fear, obligation, and guilt. These aren't just emotions. In this context, they're tools. Tools designed to cloud your judgment, to override your boundaries, and to make you betray your own sense of self. The blackmailer may not even raise their voice. They don't have to. Instead, they say things like, "After everything I've done for you? You're the only one I have. Fine, forget it. I guess I just don't matter." It's not the words that cut. It's the emotional weight they carry. The psychology behind emotional blackmail is rooted in attachment theory and control dynamics. The blackmailer, consciously or not, identifies your emotional pressure points. your need to be loved, your desire to be seen as good, your fear of abandonment. They don't need facts, they just need feelings. Once they find those vulnerabilities, they press, gently at first, then relentlessly. This is not random behavior, it's a pattern, a tactic used to get what they want without appearing aggressive. They get your compliance, but you're the one who feels responsible. That's the trap. Clinical psychologists often describe this pattern in the context of codependent relationships, where one person overfunctions emotionally to maintain the approval of the other. The blackmailer thrives in this imbalance. They offer affection, but only if you submit. They offer peace, but only if you agree. The cost of saying no becomes so high that yes becomes the path of least pain. In time, your perception begins to erode. You stop asking, "Is this fair?" and start asking, "Will this upset them?" You tiptoe. You self-edit. You apologize for things that weren't wrong, just to keep the peace. And that's the true darkness of emotional blackmail. It doesn't just bend your boundaries, it rewrites them. Psychologically, emotional blackmail activates the threat centers of the brain, particularly the amygdala, which processes fear and rejection. When someone we love or depend on implies that our actions will cause their suffering, or worse, their self-destruction, our survival instincts kick in. We comply not out of agreement, but out of panic, out of terror that we might lose them, or that they might lose themselves. In abusive relationships, this tactic escalates. What begins as emotional leverage becomes psychological imprisonment. "If you leave me, I'll hurt myself. I'll tell everyone your secrets. You'll regret this for the rest of your life." These are not just threats. They're emotional contracts signed under duress. Victims often feel trapped. If they stay, they lose themselves. If they leave, they feel like monsters. That's the genius of emotional blackmail. It creates a double bind, where every option hurts and compliance feels like the lesser evil. In families, emotional blackmail shows up in generational cycles. A parent might say, "After all I sacrificed, this is how you treat me." In truth, it's not about love, it's about control. About guilt passed down like an inheritance. Children grow into adults who still flinch at the thought of disappointing someone who raised them to fear autonomy. In workplaces, it can take the form of toxic loyalty. "Don't make me look bad. If you don't take this on, who will? We're counting on you." You're not just being asked, you're being manipulated through fear of abandonment, shame, or exclusion. It also shows up in cults and authoritarian structures where dissent is framed as betrayal, and compliance is the only proof of loyalty. To question is to threaten. To say no is to endanger the group. Under this pressure, truth dissolves, and the self becomes secondary to survival. But make no mistake, emotional blackmail is abuse, not in the explosive, obvious way that leaves bruises, but in the slow, suffocating way that leaves silence. It trains you to doubt your instincts, question your values, and see yourself only through the lens of someone else's disapproval. Over time, the cost is not just your freedom, it's your identity. Healing from emotional blackmail requires more than distance. It requires deprogramming, rebuilding a sense of worth that isn't based on someone else's reaction. Learning that guilt is not the same as wrongdoing, that fear doesn't always signal danger. Sometimes it signals growth. Therapists often guide victims through the process of reclaiming agency, setting boundaries without apology, tolerating discomfort without collapse, recognizing manipulation without internalizing blame. But the first step is awareness, naming the pattern, saying out loud, "This is not love, this is leverage." Because once you see emotional blackmail for what it is, you stop feeling like the villain for protecting yourself. And you start understanding that anyone who weaponizes your care was never caring for you. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological discomfort a person experiences when holding two or more contradictory beliefs, values, or attitudes, especially when their behavior conflicts with their self-image or internal moral code. This internal conflict creates tension, and the mind works to reduce the discomfort, often through denial, justification, or distortion of reality. The concept of cognitive dissonance was introduced in 1957 by psychologist Leon Festinger, who defined it as a state of psychological stress triggered when one's beliefs clash with their actions or with new information that challenges those beliefs. The central principle is this: People are driven to maintain internal consistency. When inconsistency arises, they are motivated, often unconsciously, to reduce it, even if doing so requires distorting the truth. One of the earliest and most cited studies on cognitive dissonance came from Festinger himself. He infiltrated a doomsday cult that believed the world would end on a specific date. When the prophecy failed, instead of abandoning their beliefs, cult members intensified their faith, claiming their devotion had saved the world. This irrational shift was a textbook reaction to overwhelming dissonance, the need to preserve belief, identity, and meaning in the face of undeniable evidence to the contrary. Cognitive dissonance is not limited to extreme groups. It exists in everyday decisions, relationships, and internal narratives. A smoker who knows smoking causes cancer yet continues to smoke may resolve the dissonance by saying, "It relaxes me," or "My grandfather smoked his whole life and lived to 90. A person who cheats on their partner may justify it by claiming the relationship wasn't fulfilling, rather than face the guilt of betrayal. In both examples, belief and behavior conflict, and so the belief bends. Psychologically, this behavior is driven by the brain's aversion to inconsistency. Neuroscience has shown that dissonance activates brain regions linked to error detection and emotional distress, particularly the anterior cingulate cortex and insula. The resulting stress is not just theoretical, it's real, biological discomfort. The brain perceives contradiction as a kind of cognitive pain and works to resolve it as quickly and efficiently as possible. However, the ways in which people resolve this dissonance are not always logical or healthy. Instead of changing behavior to match belief, individuals more often change the belief. They may devalue new evidence, reinterpret the facts, or surround themselves with like-minded individuals to reinforce their original perspective. This is where cognitive dissonance becomes dark, not because the mechanism itself is malicious, but because it protects the ego at the cost of truth. In society, this effect is amplified. Cognitive dissonance fuels political polarization, ideological extremism, and groupthink. Once someone publicly commits to an idea or belief, walking it back becomes not just uncomfortable, it becomes psychologically threatening. To admit wrongness is to face the collapse of part of one's identity. As a result, people become more entrenched in flawed ideologies, defending them despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. This is especially dangerous in environments like politics, religion, and media, where people are encouraged to adopt rigid identities. The stronger the identity, the more dissonance threatens it, and the more motivated the person is to reject new ideas, facts, or perspectives. Beliefs are not just thoughts, they become emotional investments, and dissonance threatens those investments. In relationships, cognitive dissonance explains why victims often stay with abusers. The belief, "I am a rational person who wouldn't tolerate abuse," clashes with the reality of enduring mistreatment. To reduce the dissonance, the victim may rationalize the abuser's behavior, blaming themselves or minimizing the abuse. "They were just having a bad day," or "they love me deep down." Over time, this mental rewriting creates a trauma bond, locking the person into a cycle of harm and justification. In organizations, employees may witness unethical practices, yet continue working under the belief that "my company does good things." The dissonance between what they know and what they tell themselves must be resolved, often by downplaying the wrongdoing, shifting moral responsibility, or rationalizing their silence. Cognitive dissonance also explains cult behavior and mass manipulation tactics. Cult leaders intentionally create psychological dissonance, first by offering unconditional love or enlightenment, then by applying stress, contradiction, or fear. Members experience confusion and internal conflict, and the only way to resolve it is to accept the group's narrative. Over time, critical thinking is replaced by blind obedience. Not because people are stupid, but because their minds are trying to escape the discomfort of cognitive chaos. Advertisers exploit dissonance by highlighting the gap between who you are and who you want to be. You care about your health, right? As a result, people become more entrenched in flawed ideologies, defending them despite overwhelming contradictory evidence. This is especially dangerous in environments like politics, religion, and media, where people are encouraged to adopt rigid identities. The stronger the identity, the more dissonance threatens it, and the more motivated the person is to reject new ideas, facts, or perspectives. Beliefs are not just thoughts, they become emotional investments, and dissonance threatens those investments. In relationships, cognitive dissonance explains why victims often stay with abusers. The belief, "I am a rational person who wouldn't tolerate abuse," clashes with the reality of enduring mistreatment. To reduce the dissonance, the victim may rationalize the abuser's behavior, blaming themselves or minimizing the abuse. They were just having a bad day, or they love me deep down. Over time, this mental rewriting creates a trauma bond, locking the person into a cycle of harm and justification. In organizations, employees may witness unethical practices yet continue working under the belief that my company does good things. The dissonance between what they know and what they tell themselves must be resolved, often by downplaying the wrongdoing, shifting moral responsibility, or rationalizing their silence. Cognitive dissonance also explains cult behavior and mass manipulation tactics. Cult leaders intentionally create psychological dissonance, first by offering unconditional love or enlightenment, then by applying stress, contradiction, or fear. Members experience confusion and internal conflict, and the only way to resolve it is to accept the group's narrative. Over time, critical thinking is replaced by blind obedience, not because people are stupid, but because their minds are trying to escape the discomfort of cognitive chaos. Advertisers exploit dissonance by highlighting the gap between who you are and who you want to be. You care about your health, right? Then why aren't you using our product? This strategy pressures people to change their behavior or justify their current choices to preserve self-image. It's subtle, but incredibly effective. The discomfort doesn't scream, it whispers, "You're not good enough unless..." In manipulation, dissonance becomes a tool. Abusers induce guilt, confusion, and conflicting messages, then offer conditional relief. Over time, the victim begins to question their own reality, a phenomenon related to gaslighting. They become dependent on the manipulator to resolve the mental tension. Dissonance keeps them trapped. There is also a societal dimension to cognitive dissonance. As inequality rises, people rationalize suffering. They must not be working hard enough, or if they wanted a better life, they'd make better choices. These narratives reduce dissonance between one's comfort and others' pain. The mind refuses to believe that suffering can be random or systemic, because that would mean privilege is unearned and reality is unjust. This discomfort avoidance extends even into memory. Studies show that people alter memories to match current beliefs, rather than adjust beliefs to match reality. We remember our past selves as being more consistent with our present views than they actually were. This psychological editing helps preserve a coherent self-narrative, but at the cost of honesty. Cognitive dissonance is not inherently evil. It's a survival mechanism. But its power lies in how silently it shapes our thoughts and behaviors. It allows people to justify contradictions, support corrupt systems, defend toxic relationships, and even commit atrocities while believing they're righteous. The Nazis used this principle to justify genocide. The Church used it during inquisitions. Modern political machines use it through propaganda, nationalism, and moral relativism. What makes cognitive dissonance so dangerous is how invisible it is. People rarely realize they're experiencing it. The mental rewiring happens in the background, preserving self-image at the cost of truth. The more invested someone is in a belief, financially, emotionally, socially, the more powerful the dissonance when that belief is threatened, and the more extreme their response becomes to preserve it. To become aware of dissonance is to become conscious of your own mental blind spots. It requires self-examination and discomfort. It demands the courage to admit you've been wrong, misled, or afraid to face reality. Few are willing to do that, but for those who are, it is the path to intellectual freedom and psychological clarity. Psychopathy, the cold, calculating predator. Within psychopathy is one of the darkest facets of human psychology, often portrayed in movies and crime dramas as the hallmark of cold-blooded killers and heartless criminals. Psychopathy in reality is far more insidious. It's not merely about violence, it's about a profound emotional void, ruthless manipulation, and a relentless craving for power and control. Psychopaths are the ultimate predators, not necessarily because of physical violence, but because of their ability to exploit human vulnerabilities without remorse or conscience. The term psychopath originated in the late 19th century, when early psychiatrists and psychologists first tried to categorize individuals who consistently exhibited antisocial behavior, lack of empathy, and an eerie superficial charm. The word itself comes from the Greek psyche, meaning soul or mind, and pathos, meaning suffering or disease, literally a diseased mind. But it wasn't until the 20th century that the clinical study of psychopathy gained momentum. A pivotal figure in our modern understanding of psychopathy is Dr. Robert D. Hare, a Canadian psychologist who developed the Psychopathy Checklist Revised, PCLR. This diagnostic tool measures 20 traits associated with psychopathy, including glibness, grandiosity, manipulativeness, lack of remorse, shallow affect, and impulsivity. Individuals scoring high on this scale are classified as psychopaths. Hare's work revolutionized forensic psychology, allowing mental health professionals to identify and understand psychopathic traits with a greater degree of accuracy. But what truly sets psychopaths apart is not just a checklist of behaviors. It's the neurological foundation underlying their condition. Brain imaging studies reveal stark differences in the structure and function of psychopaths' brains. Specifically, abnormalities appear in the amygdala, the region responsible for processing emotions such as fear, empathy, and guilt. Psychopaths' amygdalas tend to be smaller or less active, leading to a profound deficit in emotional processing. Coupled with this is reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain area responsible for impulse control, judgment, and moral reasoning. This neurological combination creates a mind wired to be impulsive, reckless, and coldly calculating. The psychopath doesn't feel the emotional alarms that keep most people in check. They experience a chilling emotional void. Psychopathy is sometimes confused with sociopathy, but the two have critical distinctions. Sociopathy is often viewed as the result of environmental factors, trauma, neglect, or abuse during childhood, that lead to antisocial behavior. Psychopathy, by contrast, is thought to have a stronger biological or genetic basis. While sociopaths can form attachments and experience some emotions, psychopaths are marked by their emotional shallowness and profound lack of empathy. This emotional deficit fuels the psychopath's darkest weapon, manipulation. Psychopaths are masters of deceit. Their superficial charm can be intoxicating, their confidence magnetic. They instinctively understand how to read people, identify weaknesses, and exploit vulnerabilities with surgical precision. Whether through lies, intimidation, or seduction, psychopaths manipulate others to serve their own ends. Yet this manipulation is not random. It is deliberate and cold-blooded. Unlike someone who acts out of passion or anger, the psychopath calculates every move to maximize personal gain and minimize risk. They do not hesitate to betray friends, family, or partners if it means achieving power, wealth, or control. Motivation for a psychopath is rooted in self-interest and dominance. They crave control over people and situations, seeing others as pawns or obstacles in their game. They thrive in positions where they can manipulate large groups, whether as corporate executives, politicians, con artists, or even cult leaders. Their goal is not merely survival, but domination. What makes psychopathy especially terrifying is its deceptive normalcy. Not all psychopaths are violent criminals living on society's fringes. Many are successful psychopaths, seamlessly integrated into everyday life. They appear charming, confident, and highly functional, often excelling in careers that reward ruthlessness and strategic thinking. These individuals can be found in boardrooms, political offices, and law firms, wielding power with cold efficiency while hiding their true nature behind a mask of normalcy. The consequences of interacting with a psychopath can be devastating. Victims often do not realize they have been manipulated until years later, when the psychopath has long since moved on, leaving emotional destruction in their wake. The psychopath's lack of empathy means they do not care who they hurt. Only the outcome matters. One of the most chilling aspects of psychopathy is the absence of conscience. While most people experience guilt, remorse, or regret after harming someone, psychopaths are immune to these emotions. This absence of moral restraint allows them to commit acts others would find unthinkable, whether it's fraud, emotional abuse, or even physical violence. The psychology behind this lack of conscience is linked to both the neurological abnormalities and learned behaviors. Many psychopaths exhibit a childhood marked by manipulation, deceit, and sometimes cruelty to animals or peers. This early behavior signals the development of a mind disconnected from typical human empathy and morality. Furthermore, psychopaths often engage in cognitive distortions to justify their behavior. They rationalize manipulation as necessary, view others as deserving of exploitation, or simply do not see their actions as wrong. This internal logic is frightening because it leaves no room for remorse or change. Psychopathy also reveals unsettling truths about human social structures. Psychopaths excel in environments that reward aggression, competition, and dominance. Corporate scandals, political corruption, and cult leadership often have psychopaths at their core, individuals who use charm, manipulation, and ruthlessness to climb to power while leaving destruction behind. In personal relationships, psychopaths can be devastatingly toxic. They use tactics like love bombing, overwhelming someone with attention and affection to gain control, followed by emotional abuse and gaslighting. Their partners often feel trapped in a cycle of confusion, fear, and self-doubt, unable to break free from the psychopath's psychological grip. Understanding psychopathy is critical not only for criminal justice but for everyday life. Recognizing the signs, a lack of empathy, superficial charm, manipulativeness, and deceit can help protect against becoming a victim. Awareness is the first step towards safeguarding yourself from the cold, calculating predator within society. In the end, psychopathy exposes a dark truth about humanity. Beneath the surface civility, some minds are wired to exploit, manipulate, and destroy without remorse. These predators walk among us, wearing masks of normalcy and charm, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. To survive in a world shadowed by psychopathy, one must understand it, not just as a clinical diagnosis, but as a pervasive, chilling force that lurks in the depths of human nature. Machiavellianism, the cold logic of control. Machiavellianism is not just manipulation, it's a worldview, a ruthless, calculated belief that people are tools, morality is flexible, and power is everything. It doesn't scream, it doesn't rage, it smiles, nods, and calculates quietly behind the curtain. The term comes from Niccolò Machiavelli, a 16th-century Italian diplomat and political theorist, whose name became synonymous with cunning, deceit, and strategic cruelty. His infamous political treatise, The Prince, laid out a chilling philosophy, that rulers should not strive to be good, but effective, that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. That ends, in the right hands, can justify almost any means. And while Machiavelli's original writings were nuanced, part political realism, part survival guide, the term Machiavellian evolved into something darker over time. Today, in psychology, Machiavellianism refers to a personality trait marked by manipulation, emotional detachment, a cynical view of human nature, and a relentless focus on personal gain. Machiavellians don't just manipulate, they strategize. In 1970, psychologists Richard Christie and Florence Geis developed the Mach 4 test, designed to measure levels of Machiavellianism in individuals. What they found was chilling. High Machs, those scoring high on the scale, are more likely to deceive, cheat, and exploit others if they believe they won't be caught. Not because they're impulsive, but because they believe manipulation is simply how the world works. To them, people are pieces on a chessboard. Feelings are irrelevant. Rules are obstacles. And morality? It's a tool to use against those naive enough to follow it. Unlike psychopaths, Machiavellians are usually emotionally stable. Unlike narcissists, they don't need admiration. What they crave is control, power, advantage. They are often subtle, patient, and highly strategic. They won't explode when provoked. Instead, they'll wait, watch, gather information, then strike when it hurts the most. This makes them especially dangerous in positions of influence, corporate boardrooms, political offices, legal systems, or any structure where hierarchy, secrecy, and leverage can be weaponized. What separates Machiavellians from ordinary liars is intentionality. They don't lie for fun or out of desperation. They lie with purpose. Every gesture, every word, every silence is a calculation. They study people, not to understand them, but to predict their moves and exploit their weaknesses. To the Machiavellian mind, trust is something to be faked, not earned. Psychological studies have linked high Machiavellianism to low empathy, high cognitive ability, and an instrumental view of relationships. If you are useful, they will flatter you. If you are not, they will discard you. If you are a threat, they will destroy you, often without you even realizing it's happening. In one particularly disturbing study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers found that Machiavellian individuals are more likely to engage in manipulative behaviors such as lying, flattery, and feigned emotions to achieve their goals, especially when they perceive the stakes to be high and the consequences manageable. They're not impulsive, they're deliberate. They're not emotional, they're cold. They're not explosive, they're efficient. And often they go unnoticed. Because high marks rarely brag, they often appear calm, rational, even humble. But behind that calm exterior is someone playing a much longer game than everyone else in the room. While others chase short-term rewards, the Machiavellian plans months or years ahead. In relationships, Machiavellians often appear charming, attentive, even romantic at first. But over time, patterns emerge. They isolate their partners, weaponize guilt, exploit vulnerabilities. They don't love in the way most people understand it. They invest where there is return. They commit only when it gives them an advantage. And when the usefulness ends, so does the relationship. They can pretend to be remorseful, empathetic, even kind. But these are masks, tools in their psychological toolkit. Emotions for them are weapons, not experiences. In business, they thrive in environments where competition, secrecy, and ambiguity are high. They align with power, avoid accountability, and maneuver through politics with surgical precision. They will support you when it suits them, undermine you when it doesn't, and smile while doing both. The most disturbing part? Society often rewards Machiavellian traits, especially in cutthroat systems. They rise fast, they win negotiations, they accumulate influence, they build networks not of loyalty, but of leverage. And yet, behind the facade of success is often a hollow inner world, one that fears vulnerability, distrusts intimacy, and avoids genuine connection. Because to truly connect with someone is to give up control. And to the Machiavellian, control is everything. If you've ever felt like someone knew just what to say to make you trust them, only to realize later they used that trust against you, you may have encountered a Machiavellian. If someone always seems 2 steps ahead, always calm, always reasonable, but people around them mysteriously fall apart, watch closely. It's not bad luck, it's quiet war. And by the time you realize you're playing their game, it might be too late. Narcissism, a grand illusion built on fragile foundations. Narcissism is far more than vanity. It is not just about self-love. It is about self-survival. The narcissist is not inflated with real confidence, but trapped inside a carefully constructed illusion of superiority, one built to defend against a deep and often unconscious sense of worthlessness. It is one of the darkest, most deceptive constructs of the human psyche, a personality designed to look like strength, but built entirely on fear. The term narcissism originates from Greek mythology. Narcissus was a beautiful hunter who fell in love with his own reflection in a pool of water, not realizing it was merely an image. He stared at it until he died, unable to tear himself away from the illusion of himself. That ancient story gave birth to a concept that modern psychology would later dissect in unsettling detail. In the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud introduced narcissism as a psychological concept, initially as a normal part of child development. However, as the theory evolved, psychoanalysts such as Otto Kernberg and Heinz Kohut brought to light a much darker and pathological form of narcissism. What emerged was not a trait of confidence, but a disorder of the self. Narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, is now recognized in the DSM-5, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is defined by a persistent pattern of grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a striking lack of empathy. But what makes narcissism dangerous isn't just its presence, it's the mask it wears. Narcissists often seem successful, charismatic, intelligent, and socially dominant. And that's exactly the problem. People are drawn to them. They admire them. They trust them. But underneath the charm lies a cold psychology. Studies in narcissistic behavior have shown that narcissists often experience what is called narcissistic injury, a psychological wound usually formed in early life. This injury could come from excessive praise without emotional grounding, or from trauma, neglect, or conditional love. The child learns that they are only worthy when they are exceptional. So they create a false self, an idealized image of who they must be to deserve love or safety. This false self becomes their armor and their prison. Because narcissists are deeply dependent on external validation, they are not self-confident, they are validation-dependent. They cannot tolerate criticism. They react aggressively to perceived slights. They feel threatened by the success of others. And their relationships are often shallow and exploitative, because the people around them are not seen as individuals, but as tools to feed their ego. In one 2008 study published in Personality and Social Psychology Review, researchers found that narcissists exhibit high self-esteem only in performance or status-driven domains, such as looks, power, and intelligence. Outside of those areas, their self-concept collapses. This fragility is why many narcissists appear overly competitive, hypersensitive, or even cruel when challenged. The darker the narcissism, the more dangerous it becomes. In the most extreme forms, especially when combined with psychopathy or Machiavellianism, it becomes part of what psychologists call the dark triad, a trio of personality traits linked to manipulation, exploitation, and social dominance. But even ordinary narcissism can ruin lives. In workplaces, narcissistic leaders often rise quickly but leave behind chaos. They manipulate subordinates, steal credit, and dodge blame. In romantic relationships, they may use tactics like love bombing, gaslighting, or emotional withdrawal to maintain control. They cannot accept intimacy because true closeness would expose the fragile, wounded self behind their mask. They are addicted to admiration, and like all addicts, they are willing to destroy others to get their fix. And yet, many narcissists don't seek help. Why would they? Admitting they have a problem is incompatible with their self-image. Therapy requires humility, vulnerability, introspection, all things the narcissistic mind resists. And if they do enter therapy, they often try to charm the therapist, control the process, or sabotage it entirely. In truth, narcissists don't want to heal. They want to be seen as healed. They don't want to be vulnerable. They want to be adored for pretending they are. So how do you recognize narcissism before you're drawn into its orbit? Look for patterns: inconsistency in empathy, excessive praise-seeking, disregard for others' feelings, quick idealization followed by devaluation, an inability to apologize without deflecting, blaming, or minimizing, and most importantly, an obsession with image over substance. The danger of narcissism is not just the harm it does to others, it's the decay it causes within. Narcissists live in a psychological hall of mirrors. Every reflection must flatter them. Every surface must be polished. And if the truth breaks through, even for a moment, they panic. Because deep down, beneath the grandiosity and the charm, lies someone terrified of being ordinary, terrified of being unloved, terrified of being nothing without applause. And that fear, that's the engine of narcissism. Not pride, not strength. Fear. Gaslighting. Gaslighting is one of the most disturbing psychological tactics used to control and manipulate others. At its core, it is not simply about lying, it is about reshaping someone's reality. Gaslighting slowly convinces someone to doubt their memories, their perceptions, and even their sanity. It is not an explosion, it is a slow fade, a quiet dismantling of your ability to trust your own mind. The term gaslighting comes from a 1938 play called Gaslight. In the story, a man manipulates his wife by subtly changing things around their home, like dimming the gas-powered lights. When she notices, he tells her she's imagining it, that nothing has changed, that she's losing her mind. And eventually, she believes him. Her reality is replaced by his. This story became a metaphor, and now, gaslighting is the word we use to describe this kind of psychological control. But gaslighting isn't always that obvious. It rarely starts with a direct assault. Instead, it begins with denial. You remember a conversation. They say it never happened. You recall something they did. They say you're overreacting. You feel hurt. They say you're too sensitive. And slowly, piece by piece, your version of reality is chipped away until you begin to question your own memory more than theirs. Gaslighting works because human beings are wired for trust. We believe that the people close to us want what's best for us. We assume they share our version of reality, But when that trust is used against us, our brain struggles to resolve the conflict. And instead of seeing the manipulator as dishonest, we begin to see ourselves as broken. The psychology behind gaslighting is darkly elegant. It uses your natural instincts against you. Confirmation bias makes you search for evidence that they might be right. Cognitive dissonance makes you uncomfortable with the idea that someone you love is manipulating you. So you silence your doubts, you shrink your voice, you hand over your reality to someone else because that feels safer than facing the truth. The person doing the gaslighting might be a romantic partner, a friend, a parent, or even a boss. They don't always raise their voice. In fact, they often seem calm, reasonable, even concerned. But their calmness isn't kindness, it's strategy. Because if they can stay calm while you break down, it becomes easier to label you as unstable and harder for you to fight back. Over time, gaslighting leads to deep emotional damage. It causes anxiety, self-doubt, confusion, and a constant sense of walking on eggshells. You start apologizing even when you haven't done anything wrong. You begin to ask for permission to feel. You wait for someone else to tell you what is real. And in the worst cases, you forget how to trust yourself entirely. Gaslighting doesn't always come from malice. Sometimes it comes from insecurity. People gaslight to avoid accountability, to protect their ego, to rewrite the story so they don't have to admit they were wrong. But intent doesn't erase damage. Whether it's strategic or subconscious, the result is the same. The other person's truth becomes more real than your own. What makes gaslighting especially dangerous is how invisible it can be. There are no bruises, no raised voices, just a subtle erosion of confidence. And because the changes are gradual, most victims don't realize it's happening until it's already too late. To understand gaslighting is to recognize the power of doubt. Doubt is like a virus in the mind, and gaslighting is the method of infection. It is not about disagreement. It is about psychological control. And once that control is established, the gaslighter no longer has to do anything, because you begin to gaslight yourself. The only way out is awareness. The moment you start noticing the pattern, the spell begins to break. You begin to ask, did that really happen? Am I wrong to feel this way? Or have I just been trained not to trust myself? And when those questions surface, you are not losing control. You are beginning to take it back. Recovery from gaslighting means reconnecting with your inner voice, relearning how to believe your own memories, your own instincts, your own truth. It takes time, but the mind can heal. And every time you say, I trust what I felt, I trust what I saw, you reclaim a piece of the reality that was taken from you. Gaslighting isn't about madness. It's about power. And those who use it do so because it works, because it's hard to fight what you can't see. But knowledge is light, and light is what gaslighting fears most. The Dunning-Kruger effect, one of the most quietly disturbing insights in all of psychology. It doesn't describe psychopathy or manipulation or trauma. No, it's something far more common, more widespread. It describes the false confidence of the unskilled, the way incompetence disguises itself as expertise, often with a smile and a firm opinion. At its heart, the Dunning-Kruger effect reveals a grim paradox. Those who know the least are often the most certain. And those who know the most, they often hesitate. They question. They doubt. In 1999, psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger published a study that would shake our understanding of human self-awareness. They asked participants to complete tests in grammar, logic, and humor, and then to estimate how well they had performed. The results were as chilling as they were predictable. The worst performers were the most confident in their abilities. The most wrong were the most sure. This effect isn't just a flaw in thinking, it's a flaw in self-evaluation. It's not ignorance alone that's dangerous. It's unrecognized ignorance, a kind of blindness to one's own limitations. The mind, unaware of what it lacks, creates an illusion of knowledge, and from that illusion comes dangerous certainty. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't rare. It's not a strange glitch in a few isolated individuals. It's everywhere. In meetings, in families, in political debates, in online forums where the loudest voice often carries the least depth. And most frightening of all, it lives in all of us at some point. No one is immune. When a person knows very little about a topic, they also lack the tools to see what they're missing. Their perspective is narrow. but they don't realize it. Their confidence, instead of being earned, is automatic, a byproduct of not understanding the complexity in front of them. This illusion creates fertile ground for manipulation, because confidence persuades, even false confidence. In society, we often mistake boldness for intelligence. The person who speaks most confidently is assumed to be correct. But the Dunning-Kruger effect flips that assumption on its head. What if the most vocal expert in the room is the one who understands the least? Consider how dangerous that becomes when applied to leadership, or medicine, or law, or war. When overconfidence is mistaken for competence, people follow. They trust, they comply, all while the person leading them may be deeply, dangerously unqualified. The truly skilled, the truly informed, these people often move with caution. They speak with hesitation. They are more likely to say, "I don't know," not because they're weak or uncertain, but because they understand the depth of what they're dealing with. Real knowledge brings humility. False knowledge breeds arrogance. This pattern plays out over and over again. Psychologists often describe a visual model. First, confidence spikes quickly at the beginning of learning. This is the peak of Mount Stupid, where someone knows just enough to think they know everything. But soon after, that confidence crashes. As reality sets in, the person enters the valley of despair, realizing how little they actually understand. Only with time, effort, and reflection does true confidence return, earned, not assumed. The tragedy is that many people never leave the peak. They stay there, trapped in overconfidence, unaware of the vast ocean of knowledge beneath their feet. They don't fall into the valley of despair because they never look down. And in the wrong hands, this blindness becomes a weapon. Manipulators can use the Dunning-Kruger effect like a tool. If someone doesn't know they're being misled, they're easy to control. If someone is too confident in their own opinion, they stop listening to others. They become isolated in their own certainty. They can't be taught. They can't be reasoned with. They can only argue, loudly, repeatedly. And when entire groups fall into this trap, when echo chambers reinforce false knowledge with false confidence, the effect becomes cultural. Societies stop asking questions. They reject experts. They elevate influencers over thinkers. And they trade nuance for noise. But this effect doesn't just live out there in others. It lives inside us too. Every time we think we've mastered something after only scratching the surface. Every time we dismiss complexity because we don't like how it feels. Every time we choose to be certain rather than curious. To fight this illusion, we need a kind of intellectual humility. A willingness to say, "I might be wrong." A discipline of questioning our assumptions and resisting the comfort of easy answers. We need to become suspicious of our own certainty, especially when it feels effortless. Because true understanding is never effortless. It requires patience, discipline, and most of all, doubt. The Dunning-Kruger effect reminds us of something unsettling but true. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room isn't the liar, or the villain, or the manipulator. It's the one who's wrong, but doesn't know it. The Lucifer Effect, the psychology of evil unleashed. The Lucifer Effect is a psychological theory that explores how ordinary people can commit horrific acts of evil. Coined by renowned psychologist Philip Zimbardo, it investigates the transformation from good to evil, how situational forces and systemic pressures can turn decent individuals into perpetrators of cruelty, violence, and moral collapse. Zimbardo's most famous contribution to this field came from his 1971 Stanford prison experiment, a chilling demonstration of how quickly and deeply people can become corrupted by power and anonymity. Volunteers, randomly assigned as guards or prisoners in a mock prison, rapidly descended into abusive, sadistic behavior. The experiment, intended to last 2 weeks, was halted after only 6 days due to escalating cruelty and psychological trauma. At the heart of the Lucifer Effect lies a dark truth. Evil is not only the domain of monstrous personalities, but can emerge from ordinary human nature under certain conditions. It challenges the comforting notion that bad people are born evil. Instead, it suggests that environments, roles, and group dynamics can awaken the darkest impulses within us all. Psychologically, the Lucifer Effect draws on concepts like de-individuation, where individuals lose their sense of self and moral responsibility in groups, and obedience to authority, famously demonstrated in Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiments. When people are stripped of personal accountability and immersed in oppressive systems, they may commit acts they would never consider alone. Zimbardo explains that the social environment shapes behavior far more than individual personality traits. Situations that foster anonymity, dehumanization, moral disengagement, and diffusion of responsibility pave the way for evil actions. Once these psychological barriers to empathy and conscience fall, cruelty becomes easier, almost inevitable. The motivation behind such behaviors is complex. Power intoxicates and blinds. Fear, conformity, and obedience become survival strategies. In oppressive systems, individuals may perpetrate harm to avoid punishment or maintain status. Victims become scapegoats, dehumanized and stripped of dignity, making it easier to justify brutality. Historically, the Lucifer Effect helps us understand atrocities like genocides, war crimes, and systemic abuse, instances where ordinary people commit inhuman acts under authoritarian regimes or chaotic conditions. It is a grim reminder that evil often thrives not from monstrous villains lurking in the shadows, but from everyday people caught in toxic systems. This theory has profound implications for society, ethics, and justice. It warns us to scrutinize institutions, cultures, and hierarchies that enable cruelty by normalizing abusive behavior and silencing dissent. It urges vigilance against the slippery slope from obedience to complicity. Clinically, the Lucifer Effect highlights the dangers of losing moral identity and the importance of fostering empathy, critical thinking, and personal responsibility. Rehabilitation and prevention require more than punishing bad actors. They demand dismantling environments that breed evil and promoting psychological resilience. The darkness of the Lucifer Effect lies not just in the acts of evil themselves, but in the terrifying ease with which the human mind can slip into darkness, a reminder that the capacity for cruelty is not alien but intrinsic, waiting for the right triggers. Recognizing the Lucifer Effect challenges us to confront uncomfortable questions. How would we behave under pressure? What systems do we unknowingly support that facilitate harm? And crucially, how do we prevent the descent from good to evil before it begins? In a world where power corrupts and silence enables, understanding the Lucifer Effect is essential, not only to comprehend evil, but to resist it. It is a call to moral courage, self-awareness, and systemic change, lest we all risk becoming unwitting agents of darkness. The false consensus effect. When you believe everyone thinks like you. The false consensus effect is a cognitive bias where people overestimate how much others share their beliefs, values, opinions, and behaviors. It is the dark mirror of human arrogance, the unconscious assumption that one's worldview is not only normal but universal. This mental distortion can isolate, mislead, and fuel conflict, because it blinds us to true diversity of thought and traps us in an echo chamber of our own making. First described by social psychologists Lee Ross, David Green, and Pamela House in a seminal 1977 study, the false consensus effect reveals how our need for validation warps our perception of reality. They found that individuals who engaged in certain behaviors believed that a majority of people did the same, regardless of actual statistics. It's a cognitive shortcut. If I think this, it must be true for everyone else. Psychologically, the false consensus effect serves as a comforting defense mechanism. Believing others agree with us reduces cognitive dissonance, eases social anxiety, and bolsters our sense of belonging and correctness. It paints a reassuring picture of consensus, protecting fragile egos from the chaos of uncertainty and difference. But this comfort comes at a cost. The false consensus effect deepens polarization, as groups assume their values are normative and those of others are fringe or wrong. It hardens social divisions and fuels us versus them mentalities, breeding contempt, intolerance, and conflict. On an individual level, this bias distorts decision-making and social interactions. When you believe everyone shares your views, you may act with unwarranted confidence or disregard others' perspectives. This can lead to social friction, failed negotiations, and breakdowns in communication. The origins of the false consensus effect are rooted in our social nature and survival instincts. Humans evolved in small groups where shared norms and beliefs were vital for cohesion and trust. Overestimating agreement ensured smoother social bonds and minimized conflict. But in complex modern societies, this bias can backfire, fostering misunderstanding on a massive scale. Research has shown the false consensus effect operates in many domains: politics, morality, lifestyle choices, even risky behaviors like substance use. For example, smokers often overestimate how many people smoke, justifying their habit. Politically, people assume their ideology is the majority, intensifying partisanship and gridlock. Clinically, the false consensus effect intersects with phenomena like projection, where individuals attribute their own feelings or motives to others, further blurring the line between subjective belief and objective reality. This makes it a subtle but insidious force in interpersonal dynamics. The effect is compounded by social media algorithms and echo chambers that reinforce our beliefs and shield us from dissenting views. In this digital age, the false consensus effect feeds a vicious cycle. Belief breeds bias, bias fuels selective exposure, and exposure strengthens the illusion of consensus. Its darkest implication lies in how it can justify harmful or unethical behavior. If someone believes everyone is doing it, it diminishes personal responsibility and moral accountability. This rationalization has fueled everything from corporate scandals to groupthink disasters and social injustices. Breaking free from the false consensus effect requires humility, the willingness to accept that your beliefs are not universal and that others' realities differ vastly from your own. It demands curiosity, active listening, and exposure to diverse viewpoints. But such openness threatens our psychological need for certainty, making change uncomfortable. Yet, without confronting this bias, we remain trapped in cycles of misunderstanding and division, blind to the richness and complexity of human thought. The false consensus effect is not just a cognitive error. It is a psychological prison constructed by the mind's desperate need for agreement and control. Understanding this effect is crucial in a world fractured by ideological, cultural, and social divides. It challenges us to question our assumptions, to tolerate ambiguity, and to recognize the profound diversity hidden beneath the surface of what we falsely assume is consensus. Self-fulfilling prophecy, when belief becomes reality. A self-fulfilling prophecy is a psychological phenomenon where a belief or expectation, whether true or false, influences a person's behavior in such a way that it causes the belief to come true. It is a dark and powerful loop, the mind's own biases and fears shaping reality to confirm its worst suspicions or hopes. In essence, it is the trap of the mind's own making, where expectation begets outcome, and reality bends to the will of perception. The concept of the self-fulfilling prophecy was first introduced by sociologist Robert K. Merton in 1948. Merton defined it as a false definition of a situation evoking new behavior that makes the originally false conception come true. What begins as an assumption or rumor becomes a social reality, sustained and intensified by human behavior. This psychological mechanism operates in every sphere of life, in relationships, education, workplaces, social identity, and even geopolitics. Its dark undercurrent lies in the power of expectation to manipulate not just individual actions but entire social systems, often to destructive ends. At its heart, the self-fulfilling prophecy exploits the brain's tendency to seek consistency. Once a belief is planted, whether it's "I am unworthy," "they hate me," or "this project will fail," the individual's attitudes and behaviors shift subtly to confirm that belief. The mind, craving coherence, selectively filters information, ignores contradictions, and unconsciously sabotages chances for success. In interpersonal relationships, this can create toxic cycles. Consider the parent who believes their child is incapable of success. The parent's lowered expectations translate into less support and more criticism. The child internalizes these messages, performs poorly, and confirms the original belief. The prophecy fulfills itself, not because of inherent truth, but because of the power of expectation. The same dynamic unfolds in social groups and stereotypes. Prejudiced beliefs about a group's intelligence, morality, or abilities can lead to discriminatory behavior. This, in turn, restricts opportunities and fuels the very outcomes that justify the original prejudice. It's a vicious cycle that traps entire communities in systemic inequality. In the workplace, managers who expect incompetence from certain employees may micromanage, withhold trust, or exclude them from key tasks. This environment stifles initiative and confidence, causing performance to suffer, and thus confirming the negative expectation. At a broader scale, self-fulfilling prophecies can drive political paranoia and conflict. If a nation believes another intends to attack, it may adopt aggressive postures. The other nation, seeing these moves, responds in kind, creating a spiral of hostility that makes war almost inevitable. Fear and suspicion thus manifest into reality through a deadly feedback loop. Psychologically, self-fulfilling prophecies tap into the brain's predictive nature. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for planning and expectation, influences attention and memory to prioritize confirming evidence. Meanwhile, emotional centers like the amygdala heighten vigilance toward threats, reinforcing negative cycles. Research across decades has documented self-fulfilling prophecies in classrooms, workplaces, and social interactions. One famous study by psychologist Robert Rosenthal and school principal Lenore Jacobson in the 1960s showed that teachers' expectations could significantly impact student IQ gains. Students randomly labeled as intellectual bloomers performed better because their teachers unconsciously treated them differently. Yet, the dark side is in how self-fulfilling prophecies maintain and exacerbate social injustices, personal insecurities, and destructive relationships. They imprison minds within narratives not of their making but of their belief. Breaking free requires awareness, a conscious effort to challenge assumptions and rewrite internal scripts. It demands skepticism of one's own expectations and a willingness to embrace uncertainty. Change begins when individuals or groups refuse to play into the cycle and instead act counterintuitively, expecting the best, offering trust, and creating conditions for new realities. However, this is easier said than done. The psychological pull toward consistency is strong, uncertainty is uncomfortable. Deep fears of failure, rejection, or betrayal often anchor the self-fulfilling prophecy firmly in place. The darkest truth about self-fulfilling prophecies is their invisibility. Victims rarely see how their beliefs shape their fate, attributing outcomes to fate, talent, or external forces. This ignorance perpetuates suffering, reinforces helplessness, and dims hope. Understanding the self-fulfilling prophecy reveals the profound power of the mind to create or destroy reality. It warns us that beliefs are not harmless thoughts, but active agents with the potential to shape our lives for better or worse. In the end, self-fulfilling prophecies are both a prison and a key. They confine us to patterns of thought and behavior that limit potential. Yet with insight and courage, they can be broken, unlocking the possibility for change and new futures. Groupthink, the tyranny of consensus. Groupthink is a psychological phenomenon where the desire for harmony or conformity within a group results in irrational, dysfunctional decision-making. It is the collective surrender of critical thinking to preserve unanimity, often at the expense of truth, morality, and sometimes even safety. In the dark underbelly of social psychology, groupthink is a silent, insidious force that can doom entire organizations, governments, and societies. At its core, groupthink is about the suppression of dissent. It happens when individuals prioritize belonging over honesty, when the fear of conflict outweighs the need for truth. The group becomes an echo chamber where alternative perspectives are ignored, ridiculed, or worse, silenced. This conformity leads to poor decisions, ethical compromises, and sometimes catastrophic outcomes. The term groupthink was first coined by psychologist Irving Janis in 1972, who studied the dynamics behind some of history's most disastrous policy failures, the Bay of Pigs invasion, the Challenger space shuttle disaster, and the escalation of the Vietnam War. Janis observed that in these cases, decision-making groups had insulated themselves from outside opinions, silenced internal dissent, and developed an illusion of invulnerability. This illusion is the hallmark of groupthink. When a group believes it is infallible, it becomes reckless. Warning signs, whether facts, expert advice, or ethical concerns, are dismissed as irrelevant or disloyal. The group convinces itself that because it is united, it must be right. In groupthink, individuals often censor their own doubts to avoid rocking the boat. This self-censorship is fueled by the normative social influence, the deep human need to be accepted and liked. Speaking out becomes risky. Those who challenge the group may face social punishment, exclusion, or subtle coercion. Leaders often unintentionally foster groupthink by discouraging disagreement, rewarding loyalty over critical thought, and surrounding themselves with yes men. Their need for control or affirmation blinds them to alternative viewpoints, creating a feedback loop of poor judgment. The psychological pressure is relentless. Members who hesitate or disagree may be labeled as troublemakers or outsiders. To maintain cohesion, the group enforces conformity through peer pressure, often cloaked in the language of unity and collective purpose. One of the darkest facets of groupthink is its role in ethical decay. When the group's identity becomes paramount, moral boundaries blur. Wrongdoing is rationalized as necessary for the greater good. Whistleblowers are seen as threats, not heroes. Ethical dilemmas are reframed as loyalty tests. In extreme cases, groupthink can escalate to mob mentality, where the group loses individual accountability and destructive behaviors escalate unchecked. The anonymity and diffusion of responsibility within the group embolden members to act in ways they never would alone. Historical tragedies are often textbook examples of groupthink gone wrong. The Nazi regime's horrific acts were enabled by a society that silenced dissent and celebrated ideological conformity. The Jonestown Massacre in 1978, where over 900 people died in a mass suicide murder orchestrated by cult leader Jim Jones, was fueled by extreme groupthink within a high-control environment. Even in everyday life, groupthink subtly shapes decisions in workplaces, families, social movements, and governments. It drives political polarization, fuels conspiracy theories, and undermines democratic processes. The more isolated and homogeneous a group becomes, the stronger the pull of groupthink. Psychologically, groupthink arises from a cocktail of fear, loyalty, and identity. The brain's amygdala, responsible for processing threats, triggers anxiety about social rejection. To ease this discomfort, the prefrontal cortex down-regulates critical analysis, favoring emotional safety over reasoned debate. Janis identified several symptoms of groupthink: illusions of invulnerability, collective rationalization, belief in inherent morality, stereotyping outsiders, direct pressure on dissenters, self-censorship, illusions of unanimity, and the presence of mind guards who protect the group from opposing views. Breaking free from groupthink requires courage and awareness. It demands creating an environment where dissent is not punished but encouraged. Leaders must actively seek out and consider minority opinions. Devil's advocates, anonymous voting, and outside expert consultations are tools designed to counteract the phenomenon. However, the path is fraught. Speaking against the grain can mean risking relationships, careers, or social standing. For those trapped in toxic group dynamics, the question becomes not just how to think critically, but how to survive the fallout of breaking consensus. Groupthink's power lies in its invisibility. It doesn't roar. It whispers, "We're all in this together." But that very whisper can suffocate individuality, morality, and truth. It can turn groups into echo chambers where reason dies and destruction begins. In the end, groupthink is a stark reminder of the fragility of human judgment when submerged in the tides of conformity. It reveals how our deepest need to belong can become a weapon, one that can undermine progress, destroy lives, and leave behind legacies of failure. Understanding groupthink is not just academic. It's a survival skill for anyone who wants to think freely, act ethically, and resist the dark seduction of the crowd. Moral licensing, the psychology of justified corruption. Moral licensing is the quiet permission slip your brain writes after you do something good. It's the mental loophole that says, "I've earned this," even when this is harmful, unethical, or hypocritical. It's the way we let ourselves off the hook, simply because we did the right thing once. In simple terms, moral licensing is a cognitive bias that occurs when a person's past moral behavior makes them more likely to make immoral choices in the future, without guilt. The good act becomes a psychological credit, a deposit in the moral bank account, and once that account has balance, the mind feels entitled to spend it, even if it means doing something wrong. It doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't sound like, "Now I can be evil." It sounds more like, "I donated, so I deserve this indulgence. I've been loyal, so this little betrayal doesn't count. I stood up for someone once, so I'm not a bad person if I stay silent now." This is the paradox. The better you feel about yourself, the more likely you are to violate your own values. The concept was first studied deeply by psychologists Benoit Monin and Dale Miller at Stanford University in the early 2000s. In a series of experiments, they found that people who affirmed their own morality by choosing a diverse candidate in a hypothetical hiring task, for example, were more likely to make biased or discriminatory choices shortly afterward. Doing good didn't just make them moral, it made them feel licensed to stop trying. In essence, moral licensing doesn't build character, it drains it. It's not about good or bad deeds, but about identity. The moment we define ourselves as a good person, we start operating from the assumption that our actions, by definition, can't be bad. The label becomes armor, and that armor can be dangerous. This is why the most powerful moral licenses are unconscious. The person cheating on their partner might still see themselves as a good husband. The executive cutting ethical corners at work still believes she's a person of integrity. After all, she volunteers. He pays the bills. She loves her children. He gave to charity last month. The cognitive dissonance doesn't register, because the past good deed functions as a psychological shield, a cloak of self-righteousness. Politically, moral licensing is everywhere. A leader who passes a popular progressive policy may feel justified in abusing power elsewhere. A citizen who votes for a cause they believe in might later excuse behavior that directly contradicts those values, because in their minds they've already proven where they stand. It also plays out in systems of oppression. Research has shown that individuals who support a marginalized group once, say through a public gesture or a vote, may later feel more comfortable expressing prejudice, believing their record proves they are not biased. In other words, virtue becomes currency, and once spent, morality can be abandoned, guilt-free. Even companies use this logic. A corporation may champion a social cause in one campaign, only to exploit workers or dodge taxes behind the scenes. But the public image, the visible virtue, acts as a license. They've shown their good side, and now they can hide behind it. But moral licensing isn't just corporate or political, it's deeply personal. You exercise in the morning and justify junk food at night. You were patient with your partner yesterday, so you allow yourself to lash out today. You resisted temptation last time, so this time you deserve to give in. The behavior becomes transactional. Ethics become negotiable. Psychologically, moral licensing is linked to ego depletion, the idea that self-control is a finite resource. When we exert effort to do the right thing, we feel drained, as if we've paid our dues. The result? The brain starts looking for a reward, and often that reward violates the very discipline we work to build. But the darkest aspect of moral licensing is not what it makes us do, it's what it allows us to ignore. It lets us look away, tune out, justify our silence. I've done my part, we say. I've already helped. But justice isn't a one-time transaction. Integrity doesn't come with a receipt. In the therapeutic context, moral licensing becomes a form of avoidance. Someone might attend therapy, journal their feelings, or meditate, but still refuse to confront their toxic behavior. They confuse effort with transformation. They treat healing as a checklist, not a confrontation with the self. Worse, moral licensing can reinforce narcissistic traits. For individuals who already view themselves as morally superior, each good deed is proof of their identity, a reason to avoid accountability. Apologies become unnecessary. Introspection feels insulting. After all, how could someone as good as me possibly be wrong? And in abusive dynamics, moral licensing becomes a weapon. A manipulator might bring up their past kindnesses, not as memories, but as shields against criticism. After all I've done for you, you owe me. It's not gratitude, it's leverage. Their good acts are now tools of control. But here's the truth. Real morality doesn't erase accountability, it invites it. A good act doesn't make you good forever. It makes you responsible, to keep trying. The opposite of moral licensing is humility. It's the understanding that morality is a path, not a performance. That doing good once doesn't give you a pass. That integrity isn't something you prove. It's something you maintain, one decision at a time. In a world obsessed with virtue signaling and public image, moral licensing thrives. But if we are to be honest with ourselves, we must ask, am I doing this because it's right, or because it gives me permission to do wrong later? Am I using my past as a mirror or a mask? Because the moment we start using morality as credit, we stop growing. And if we're not careful, the very thing we pride ourselves on, our goodness, can become the most dangerous illusion we live under. Psychological reactance, the rebellion reflex. Psychological reactance is the invisible force that compels people to resist control, even when that control is in their best interest. It is not reason. It is not logic. It is a deep emotional reflex wired into the human psyche that says, "Don't tell me what to do." It's a rebellion against perceived threats to autonomy, even subtle ones, even imagined ones. The term was coined by psychologist Jack Brem in 1966. His theory proposed that when individuals perceive that their freedom to choose is being restricted, or even might be restricted, they experience a motivational state of psychological arousal, a discomfort, a pushback, a compulsion to reassert control, even if it means making irrational or self-destructive choices. This is why children do the exact opposite of what they're told. Why teenagers sabotage their own opportunities just to defy rules. Why adults resist advice, not because it's wrong, but because they didn't ask for it. In essence, psychological reactance is the mind's fight-or-flight response to control. But it's not always loud. It can be passive, subtle, ignoring a command out of spite, doing something forbidden simply because it's forbidden, losing interest in something the moment it's recommended too strongly. And in its darker expressions, it becomes sabotage of relationships, goals, even survival. Neurologically, psychological reactance is associated with the activation of the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex, regions of the brain involved in detecting threats and regulating emotion. When autonomy feels compromised, these systems fire as if the self is under attack. The brain does not distinguish between an emotional threat and a physical one. It only knows that control is slipping away. This is why people resist laws, guidelines, and even health advice, not because they misunderstand, but because they feel cornered, told, trapped. The more forcefully someone is told what to believe or how to act, the more likely they are to reject it, not on the merits of the message, but out of defiance. This is the dark irony of control. The harder you push, the harder people push back. In personal relationships, psychological reactance can ruin communication. A partner may suggest a boundary, but if it's delivered as an order rather than an invitation, the other may instinctively resist, even if they agree in principle. The request feels like a leash. The reaction is not to the content, but to the tone of control. Manipulators understand this too. That's why skilled influencers avoid direct commands. They plant ideas subtly. They create the illusion of choice. You're free to decide, of course, only if you feel comfortable. Just a suggestion. Because once someone feels free, they are more likely to comply. But once they feel forced, even if gently, the resistance begins. And it is emotional, not rational. This principle is exploited everywhere, in advertising, sales, cult recruitment, and political propaganda. The trick is to create the illusion of autonomy, to let people believe they've made their own choice, when in fact they were guided all along. But the most dangerous expression of psychological reactance isn't in defying others, it's in self-sabotage. Some people reject opportunities simply because they were offered by authority. They abandon goals that suddenly feel imposed rather than chosen. They stay in toxic cycles, not because they enjoy the pain, but because leaving would mean surrendering control. And, for a person wired by trauma or distrust, nothing feels more threatening than dependence, even on something good. This is why therapy fails for some. The therapist becomes a perceived authority. The advice, though sound, feels like intrusion. The help feels like pressure. So they resist, not because they're unwilling, but because they're scared of losing agency. Reactance also fuels extremism. In authoritarian societies, harsh control creates black markets of thought. Forbidden books become sacred. Underground ideas flourish. Censorship backfires. Because the more aggressively something is banned, the more power it gains as a symbol of resistance. The same dynamic plays out in families. A parent bans a friend, so the child clings harder. A teen is forbidden from going out and sneaks out instead. The restriction creates the craving. The prohibition creates the obsession. Reactance is powerful, it is primal, and when misunderstood, it can be destructive. But there is another layer, a darker manipulation of reactance. Some people deliberately provoke it to gain control by appearing to relinquish it. A skilled manipulator might present themselves as harmless, even submissive, triggering the target's instinct to assert dominance. In doing so, they allow the target to feel powerful while guiding the outcome from beneath. This is psychological judo, turning the resistance reflex into a weapon by never triggering it directly. To defend against psychological reactance, we must understand its core, the fear of losing the self. Reactance is not always irrational. Sometimes it's the only defense a person has when they feel cornered, dismissed, or patronized. But the key is awareness. When you feel the urge to rebel, pause. Ask yourself, am I reacting to the message or to the method? Is the advice bad or just badly delivered? Is the threat real or just perceived? Because psychological reactance can protect you, but it can also enslave you. If you're always running from control, you'll spend your life in defiance, not direction. You'll confuse autonomy with isolation, freedom with avoidance. You'll say no not because it's right, but because it's yours. And in that chase to protect your independence, you might lose everything else. The IKEA Effect. Why is it that we sometimes overvalue things we've made with our own hands, even if they're clumsy, inefficient, or downright ugly? You follow a recipe and make a cake that's slightly burnt and lopsided. But to you, it's perfect. You built a DIY bookshelf that wobbles every time you walk by, but it still feels like a masterpiece. That's not irrational sentimentality. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon called the IKEA Effect. And once you understand how it works, you'll start seeing it everywhere, from your workspace to your relationships, even your decision-making. Let's break it down. The IKEA effect is the tendency for people to overvalue things they've partially or fully created themselves, regardless of quality. The term was coined in 2011 by behavioral scientists Michael Norton, Dan Ariely, and Daniel Mocon. In one of their studies, participants were asked to assemble simple IKEA furniture, like a storage box. Afterwards, they were asked how much they'd be willing to pay for it. Amazingly, they placed almost the same value on their amateur, self-assembled box as on a professionally built version. That's like building a $20 nightstand and feeling like it's worth $200. And it wasn't just about furniture. The effect showed up in origami, Lego, and even customized marketing pitches. What mattered wasn't the final product. What mattered was the effort. So, what's going on here? Psychologists believe the IKEA effect is powered by a few key mechanisms. 1. Effort justification. When we work hard at something, our brain wants to believe the effort was worthwhile. So, we inflate the value of the outcome to justify that investment. This is a form of cognitive dissonance resolution. I wouldn't spend 4 hours building this if it weren't amazing, so it must be amazing. 2. Perceived ownership. When we build something, even poorly, we feel a sense of ownership, and ownership increases perceived value. This is similar to the endowment effect, where people value things more just because they own them. Number 3, identity and agency. What we create feels like an extension of ourselves. That bookshelf, that pitch deck, that messy little startup idea, it's yours. And because we built it, we become emotionally attached to it, even when objective quality doesn't match. In short, when we put ourselves into something, it becomes more than just a thing. It becomes personal. This isn't just about DIY furniture. The IKEA effect shows up everywhere. A manager sticks with a clunky workflow because they designed it. A founder clings to a flawed business model because they built it from scratch. A student resists feedback on their paper because they worked hard on it. Ever watch a cooking competition? Chefs will defend their dish to the death, even if the judges hate it. That's the IKEA effect. And it's not just about what we build. It's about how much we value our own effort, even when it leads us astray. Here's where it gets tricky. The IKEA effect can motivate us. It can help us take pride in our work, persist through challenges, and care more deeply about outcomes. But it can also blind us. We might refuse to pivot from a bad idea, reject helpful feedback, keep pouring time and money into a failing project because I've already come this far. Sound familiar? That's where the IKEA effect overlaps with the sunk cost fallacy, the trap of continuing a bad investment just because of what you've already spent. Both are emotional, both are irrational, and both can be dangerous if we don't check ourselves. Using the IKEA effect for good, Now here's the good news. The IKEA effect isn't inherently bad. In fact, when used intentionally, it can boost motivation, engagement, and learning. Companies use it in clever ways. Customization platforms like Build-A-Bear or Nike ID let you create your own product, making you value it more. Gamified apps let you build your progress, whether it's fitness streaks, language milestones, or project dashboards. Managers who involve employees in designing solutions often get more buy-in because people support what they help create. In education, students learn better when they construct their own knowledge through problem-solving, peer teaching, and self-explanation. Why? Because building equals investment, and investment equals value. Just remember, not all effort leads to excellence. Sometimes what you build needs to be revised or even replaced. Want to keep the benefits of the IKEA effect without falling into its traps? Here's how. Seek feedback early. Don't wait until you're emotionally attached. Bring in outside perspectives while you're still open to change. Test ideas objectively. Data, ego. Let performance, not pride, guide your decisions. Be willing to scrap and rebuild, even if you poured your heart into it. Sometimes the best move is to let go. Celebrate effort, not outcome. Value the process of building, but don't confuse effort with quality. The IKEA effect teaches us something profound. We don't just value what's good, we value what we create. And that can be a powerful driver of passion, ownership, and pride when kept in balance. So the next time you find yourself defending a half-broken system, an awkward design, or a dubious decision, pause and ask, do I love this because it's valuable, or just because I built it? That question might just save you hours, dollars, or years of effort. Cognitive load theory. Why is it that sometimes learning feels easy, like pieces of a puzzle falling into place, while other times it's like your brain is swimming in glue? You're reading, rereading, watching, trying, but nothing sticks. You feel overwhelmed, exhausted, and maybe even a little defeated. That's not a lack of intelligence or motivation. More often than not, it's a simple matter of cognitive load. Cognitive load theory is one of the most powerful and practical psychological models for understanding how we learn and why we sometimes fail to. It's the science of mental bandwidth. And once you understand how it works, you'll never look at learning or teaching the same way again. Let's break it down. Cognitive load theory, or CLT, was developed by John Sweller, an Australian educational psychologist, in the 1980s. His core insight was deceptively simple. The human brain has limited working memory capacity. Try to overload it, and learning stops. Try to optimize it, and learning accelerates. Think of working memory like the RAM of a computer. You can only hold a few pieces of information at once, typically around 7 items, give or take. Long-term memory, on the other hand, is like the hard drive, vast, powerful, but much slower to access. So when we learn, we're essentially trying to move things from short-term high working memory into long-term memory, without maxing out that limited capacity. Sweller identified 3 types of cognitive load. 1. Intrinsic load. This is the inherent difficulty of the material itself. Learning algebra is harder than learning addition because it naturally requires more mental effort. You can't remove this kind of load, but you can manage it. 2. Extraneous load. This is the unnecessary mental effort caused by bad instruction. Think of confusing diagrams, cluttered PowerPoint slides, or a professor jumping between 5 ideas without a clear thread. This is the load we can reduce. 3. Germane load. This is the helpful kind of load. It's the mental effort you spend on actually understanding, making connections, and building schemas in your brain. This is the load we want to increase. The goal? Reduce extraneous load, manage intrinsic load, and optimize for germane load. Let's say 2 students are trying to learn the same concept in physics, Newton's laws. Student A reads a well-organized textbook with clear diagrams, consistent terminology, and worked examples. Student B watches a chaotic YouTube video with flashy animations, jump cuts, and jokes that interrupt the flow. Guess who's learning more? Student A, because they're experiencing less extraneous load. Their brain is freed up to focus on what matters, the concept, not decoding the chaos. Cognitive load theory is why students sometimes learn less from overly entertaining teachers. Flashy doesn't equal effective. In fact, overloading learners with unnecessary novelty is one of the most common instructional mistakes. But cognitive load theory doesn't just apply to classrooms. It's used everywhere, from online courses to training videos to UX design. For example, Google's search page is famously simple: a single box, minimal clutter. That's not an accident. It's designed to minimize cognitive load, so you focus on the task, searching, without distraction. Compare that to older websites from the early 2000s. Walls of text, flash animations, background music, overwhelming, unusable. That's what high extraneous load looks like in the wild. The limitations of working memory are backed by decades of research. George A. Miller, in his 1956 paper, The Magical Number 7 ± 2, found that most people can only hold around 5 to 9 chunks of information at once. But here's the kicker. Those chunks can be expanded. Through schema building, you can combine pieces of information into a single, meaningful unit. For example, a chess master can look at a board and remember 20-piece positions, not because their memory is better, but because they recognize patterns. To them, it's not 20 separate facts, it's one familiar configuration. This is why prior knowledge matters. The more you know, the more you can chunk, and the more you chunk, the more efficiently you learn. So what happens when cognitive load goes unmanaged? You burn out, you get distracted, you hit mental roadblocks. Ever tried learning while constantly switching tabs, or reading while texting? That's split attention effect, another concept within CLT. Dividing your attention forces your brain to reallocate its limited working memory. Each switch drains your capacity. Eventually, the learning just stops. This is why multitasking is the enemy of deep learning, and why minimal focused study sessions beat long, distracted ones. So, how can you use cognitive load theory to learn more effectively? Here's how. 1. Simplify your inputs. Choose clean, structured resources. Avoid overly dense texts or infotainment. Style videos when you're trying to deeply learn. 2. Work in chunks. Use the Pomodoro technique. 25 minutes of focused learning, 5-minute break. This mimics the natural rhythm of working memory. 3. Avoid multitasking. One task at a time. No distractions. Put your phone in another room. 4. Pre-train yourself. Get familiar with the vocabulary or basic structure before diving into hard material. This lowers intrinsic load. 5. Use worked examples. Studying solutions or walkthroughs helps build schemas faster than unguided problem solving. 6. Practice retrieval. Quizzing yourself, summarizing out loud, or teaching someone else strengthens your long-term memory while managing load. 7. Space out your learning. Don't cram. Spacing learning over time is cognitively easier and more effective. Let's say you just started a new job and are learning a complex software system. If your trainer throws 10 tools at you on day 1, you're likely to freeze. But if they start with just 2 essential functions, demonstrate them clearly, let you try them, and only then move on. That's cognitive load theory in action. Less stress, more retention. This applies to everything: language learning, musical instruments, even sports. Overload equals confusion. Pacing, mastery. In the digital age where information is everywhere, understanding cognitive load is more important than ever. Instructional designers, app developers, and educators now use CLT to design more effective systems. That's why platforms like Duolingo, Notion, and even TikTok use short, focused snippets. They're optimized for how your brain naturally processes information. But there's a trade-off. Just because something's easy to consume doesn't mean it's effective for deep learning. True understanding often requires effort, but it should be the right kind of effort, not wasted effort on navigating a bad learning experience. Cognitive load theory teaches us that learning is not just about effort. It's about efficient effort. Your working memory has limits. Respect them. Minimize distractions. Simplify input. Build schemas. And don't let poor instruction sabotage your potential. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone trying to learn something new, understanding how your brain works gives you the edge, not by grinding harder, but by learning smarter. The sunk cost fallacy is one of the most deceptively simple yet devastatingly effective psychological traps that impacts us all, often without us ever noticing. Whether it's staying in a job you hate, a relationship that's going nowhere, or continuing to fund a failing business venture, what drives us to keep going, even when we know deep down it's time to walk away? At its core, the sunk cost fallacy is the irrational tendency to continue investing in something simply because we've already put time, money, or effort into it, even when continuing no longer makes sense. It's the human mind clinging to the past rather than focusing on the future. And understanding this fallacy can be a game changer for your personal decisions, relationships, finances, and long-term well-being. Let's dive deep into the psychology, science, real-life examples, and how to finally free yourself from the grip of sunk costs. The term sunk cost comes from economics. A sunk cost is simply a cost that has already been incurred and cannot be recovered. It's done, gone, non-refundable. But the fallacy, what psychologists and behavioral economists refer to as a cognitive bias, is what happens when we allow these past costs to unduly influence our current decisions. For example, let's say you buy $100 a ticket to a concert. On the night of the show, you come down with a fever. You're exhausted. You'd much rather stay home and rest. But you think to yourself, I paid $100. I can't let that go to waste. So you force yourself to go and end up feeling miserable. That decision was no longer about enjoyment or health. It was about not wanting to waste the money. And that is the sunk cost fallacy in action. Dr. Daniel Kahneman, Nobel laureate and one of the fathers of behavioral economics, explored this fallacy extensively. In his groundbreaking book, Thinking Fast and Slow, he explains how humans are wired for loss aversion. We fear losses much more than we enjoy equivalent gains. This fear can lead us to irrational behaviors, where the pain of letting go outweighs the logic of cutting our losses. We justify, rationalize, and persist. And in doing so, we often throw good resources after bad. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't just show up in economic decisions. It's everywhere. You've probably encountered someone, maybe even yourself, who stayed in a relationship long past its expiration date because we've already been together for 5 years. Or maybe you've continued watching a TV series that's lost its spark just because I've already watched 4 seasons. Or let's talk about that person who keeps driving a beat-up car, pouring money into repairs, saying, I've already spent so much fixing it, I can't give up now. This logic seems sound on the surface, but here's the trap. The past is over. That time, money, or energy is gone. It shouldn't factor into whether continuing is the best move now. Perhaps one of the most famous examples in history is the Concorde fallacy, named after the supersonic airplane developed jointly by the British and French governments. Despite massive financial losses and evidence that the aircraft would never be commercially viable, they continued funding the project simply because they had already invested so much. Billions were poured into it before they eventually retired the jet in 2003. In fact, the British Treasury even used the phrase, "we can't give up now," in budget justifications. Sound familiar? Modern business isn't immune either. In Silicon Valley, startups often fall into the trap of continuing to develop a failing app or product line simply because we've spent too much time building this. The fear of abandoning all that sunk development leads them to ignore warning signs from the market. Instead of pivoting, they double down, and eventually, they crash. Dr. Leon Festinger, a pioneering social psychologist, introduced the concept of cognitive dissonance, the mental discomfort we feel when we hold 2 conflicting beliefs. When you've invested heavily in something and you're told it's a bad idea to continue, your brain rebels. But I worked so hard, but I spent so much money. That discomfort drives us to cling to the illusion of value, even when it's no longer serving us. The sunk cost fallacy is one of the mind's coping mechanisms for this dissonance. It reassures us, keep going. Don't give up now. Salvage what you can. But real strength lies in knowing when to stop. So how do you spot the sunk cost fallacy in your own life? Here are some signs. You feel emotionally attached to your past investment, even though the current situation is no longer beneficial. You find yourself saying, I've already spent so much on this, as your main reason for continuing. You ignore better alternatives simply because of what you've already committed. You fear what others will think if you quit or change direction. Awareness is your first defense. But how do you break free? The truth is we've all fallen for the sunk cost fallacy. It's human. It's understandable. But the real freedom comes from seeing it clearly and choosing not to let past effort dictate future choices. You don't owe your past anything, except the wisdom you've gained. And just because you started down one path doesn't mean you're obligated to finish it if it no longer leads where you want to go. Whether it's in money, time, career, or love, let go when it makes sense to. Don't double down on a mistake just because you spent a long time making it. Sometimes the smartest move is to stop. The mere exposure effect is the tendency to develop a preference for things or people simply because we're exposed to them repeatedly. No emotional connection is necessary, no rational decision-making. The mind registers familiarity and translates it into liking. The more you see something, the safer it feels. The more familiar it becomes, the more favorably you respond. It doesn't have to be good, it just has to be known. Psychologist Robert Zajonc, who first explored this effect in the 1960s, found that people consistently rated nonsense words, abstract images, and even unfamiliar faces as more likable, simply because they had seen them before. This effect slips beneath the radar of your conscious mind. You hear a song on the radio that annoys you. By the 10th listen, it's your guilty pleasure. You see a stranger on the train every morning. Soon they feel like a friend. You keep scrolling past a face online, and suddenly you're convinced they're trustworthy. It's not magic, it's not merit, it's exposure. Marketers exploit this constantly. Politicians know it intuitively. The more you see their face, the more you hear their slogans, the more they embed themselves in your brain, not because they're right, but because they're present. Want to be liked? Don't try too hard. Just be there. Repeatedly. Quietly. Persistently. Want someone to trust your brand, your name, your message? Put it in front of them, again and again. Familiarity is mistaken for credibility far more often than we care to admit. It's why repetition is a weapon in advertising, propaganda, and even cult indoctrination. The brain equates familiarity with truth. Say something enough times and it feels real, even if it's a lie. But there's a dark side to familiarity. Manipulators use it to gain access to your instincts. Repeated presence creates comfort, even when that presence is toxic. Abusers reappear until you accept them. Con artists become household names. Dangerous ideologies don't force themselves into your mind. They walk in through the back door of repetition. That ad you keep seeing, that political face you can't avoid, that influencer who just keeps popping up. They're not winning your mind. They're drowning it. And once you're familiar with them, your brain lets its guard down. The mere exposure effect isn't evil. It's a cognitive shortcut built for survival, but in the wrong hands it becomes a tool for exploitation. So if you want to take control, ask yourself, do I actually like this, or is it just familiar? Do I trust this, or have I just seen it too many times to question it anymore? Am I making a choice or following a pattern laid out for me? Repetition is persuasive, but awareness is power. In a world designed to hijack your attention, familiarity is the new influence. And if you're not careful, what feels comfortable might be the most dangerous thing of all. The just world hypothesis. It sounds harmless, almost comforting. The belief that the world is fundamentally fair, that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to those who deserve it. At first glance, it feels like a moral compass, a universal law that punishes the wicked and rewards the righteous. But dig a little deeper and you'll find something much darker. The just world hypothesis isn't justice. It's delusion, and it might be one of the most dangerous psychological lies we've ever told ourselves. At its core, the just world hypothesis is a cognitive bias, our brain's desperate attempt to make sense of a chaotic, unpredictable world. We want to believe that life is fair, that effort leads to success, and that those who suffer must have done something to deserve it. It helps us sleep at night. It creates order. But in reality, it blinds us to injustice. It makes us complicit in suffering. And worst of all, it turns victims into villains. Psychologist Melvin Lerner first identified this phenomenon in the 1960s. In a series of chilling experiments, he observed how people reacted to witnessing someone suffer, someone they couldn't help. The results were disturbing. Instead of showing empathy, many observers concluded that the victim must have done something wrong, that somehow they brought it upon themselves. This wasn't cruelty, it was coping, a psychological defense mechanism. Because if the world isn't fair, if bad things can happen to innocent people, then bad things can happen to us. and that truth is terrifying. So instead, we rewrite the story. We blame the victim. The woman who was assaulted? She must have been dressed provocatively. The homeless man? Probably lazy. The sick person? Didn't take care of themselves. This mental rewriting is often subconscious, but the effect is real. We don't see victims. We see justice, even when there is none. This is the just world hypothesis in action, and it's everywhere. In courtrooms, juries are more likely to assign blame to victims if the consequences are especially severe. In media, stories of suffering are often framed in ways that suggest personal responsibility. In politics, policies that punish the poor or marginalized are justified by the idea that they made bad choices. The world, we are told, is fair. Everyone gets what they deserve. But what if that's the biggest lie of all? The just world hypothesis is comforting precisely because it's false. Reality is messy. Innocent people suffer, hard-working people fail, evil people thrive. And admitting that we live in a world where luck, power, and cruelty often outweigh virtue is psychologically destabilizing. So instead, we cling to the illusion. We tell ourselves stories that preserve the lie. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. The just world hypothesis doesn't just warp how we view others, it warps how we view ourselves. When something terrible happens to us, we often blame ourselves, even when we're not at fault. Why? Because it preserves the illusion that the world is still fair. If I was assaulted, I must have done something wrong. If I lost my job, maybe I wasn't good enough. If I got sick, maybe I deserved it. This internalized guilt isn't just tragic, it's trauma. People walk around carrying shame for things that were never their fault, because deep down they'd rather feel guilty than powerless. This psychological trap runs deep. Think about how we treat success. When someone becomes wealthy or famous, we idolize them. We assume they must be smart, hard-working, brilliant, because success must mean virtue. But often their success was built on privilege, manipulation, or exploitation, and still we worship them. Because if we admit they didn't earn it, what does that say about us? What does that say about the rules we're playing by? The just world hypothesis feeds into toxic ideologies. It fuels racism, sexism, classism, because it allows the powerful to justify their dominance. They're poor because they're lazy. She didn't get promoted because she wasn't assertive enough. He got arrested because he's dangerous. These aren't objective assessments. They're comforting lies. Narratives that let us look away from inequality and sleep at night. It also creates a society where empathy is seen as weakness, where justice becomes revenge, where we ignore systemic problems because we'd rather believe in personal failure. If everything is fair, then nothing needs to change. The system isn't broken, you are. So what's the alternative? It's not nihilism. It's awareness, a conscious rejection of the lie. Understanding that life is not fair, and never was, frees us to see clearly, to stop blaming the victim, to stop punishing the poor, to stop idolizing the rich. It lets us feel real empathy, not the sanitized kind, the raw kind, the kind that acknowledges pain without needing to justify it, the kind that sees a homeless person and thinks not what did they do wrong, but what happened to them, the kind that sees suffering and responds with action, not judgment. The just world hypothesis is a powerful illusion, but like all illusions, it can be shattered. And once it is, we can begin to see people for who they really are, not as characters in a moral fable, but as human beings caught in the chaos of an unfair world, doing their best to survive. Some succeed, some don't, not because they deserve it, but because life is messy, brutal, and deeply unpredictable. The truth is hard. The world is not just, but we can be. That's the real challenge, to resist the urge to simplify, to see pain without rationalizing it, to acknowledge privilege without excusing it, to fight for justice not because the world guarantees it, but because it doesn't. If the just world hypothesis is the lie we all want to believe, then justice must be the truth we fight to create. Not with blind faith, but with open eyes, and a willingness to see what most people refuse to.